Welcome, weary traveller, to a realm where golden grace once flowed like honey through ancient lands, and where the stars themselves held dominion over fate. Tonight, we venture into the vast tapestry of the lands between, from the primordial dawn of creation to the twilight of gods and the rise of the Tarnished. Here, in this space between waking and dreaming, we shall traverse epochs of glory and ruin, witness the birth and death of ages, and explore the eternal cycle of order and chaos. Close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and allow the ancient stories to carry you into peaceful rest. In the beginning, there was nothing but the vast emptiness of the void, a darkness so complete that it held within it all possibilities yet realized none. This was not the mere absence of light, but something far more profound, the pregnant silence that exists before the first word is spoken, the infinite potential that precedes all creation. From this boundless nothingness would come the great rupture, that cosmic sundering which would tear apart the very fabric of non-existence and scatter the seeds of reality across the infinite expanse. The great rupture was not a gentle birthing, but a violent explosion of possibility, a cataclysmic event that echoed through dimensions yet unformed and set in motion forces beyond mortal comprehension. From this primordial explosion came stardust, those glimmering fragments of pure potential that would drift across the nascent cosmos like golden tears shed by creation itself. Each particle carried within it the essence of what would become life, consciousness, and the endless struggle between order and chaos that would define all existence to come. In the wake of this cosmic awakening came the greater will, that vast intelligence whose nature transcends easy understanding. Whether it was the cause of the great rupture or merely the first consciousness to emerge from its aftermath remains one of the universe's deepest mysteries. What we can say with certainty is that the greater will embodied the principle of order itself, the force that would shape the scattered stardust into coherent patterns and guide the formation of worlds, stars, and the fundamental laws that would govern reality. The greater will was not a god in any sense that mortals might understand, but something far more abstract and alien, a cosmic principle given consciousness, an ordering force that sought to impose meaning upon meaninglessness. Its influence spread through the newly formed cosmos like golden threads weaving through a tapestry, connecting distant points of light and establishing the foundations upon which civilizations would one day rise and fall. Yet even from the earliest moments of creation, there were forces that resisted this ordering principle, chaotic currents that flowed against the greater will's design. As the stardust settled into the patterns ordained by the greater will's influence, the first sparks of life began to kindle in the depths of space. These were not yet the complex forms of existence that would populate worlds in ages to come, but something far more fundamental, the basic organizing principles that would allow matter to arrange itself into increasingly sophisticated configurations. Life, as it would come to be understood, was still eons away, but the potential for consciousness was already embedded in the very structure of reality. The crucible emerged from this cosmic confluence as something that was neither purely ordered nor entirely chaotic, but rather a synthesis of both principles, a primordial soup of possibility where all forms of existence could mingle and merge without distinction. The crucible was life in its most raw and unrefined state, a seething mass of potential where the boundaries between species, between individual and collective, between self and other, held no meaning. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, representing both the infinite creativity of existence and the price of uncontrolled growth. Within the churning depths of the crucible, Forms arose and dissolved with dreamlike fluidity. Creatures that combined the characteristics of beasts, plants, and beings yet to be imagined flickered in and out of existence, their brief lives serving as experiments in the fundamental nature of what it meant to be alive. The crucible cared nothing for the distinctions that would later divide the world into neat categories. It was a realm where dragons might sprout flowers, where trees could walk and think, where the very concept of fixed identity was meaningless. The greater will observed these chaotic experiments with what might charitably be called patience, though its true motivations remained inscrutable. Perhaps it saw in the crucible's wild creativity the raw material from which more stable forms of life could eventually be refined. Perhaps it recognized that order without the possibility of change would lead to stagnation and death. Or perhaps it simply understood that even the mightiest cosmic force must work within certain constraints, that absolute order was as impossible and ultimately destructive as absolute chaos. As eons passed in the cosmic dance between order and disorder, new players entered the game. The outer gods began to manifest at the edges of reality, beings whose origins and purposes remained shrouded in mystery. Unlike the greater will, which sought to impose consistent patterns across all existence, the outer gods represented specialized forms of influence, each one embodying particular aspects of reality taken to their logical extremes. They were forces of nature given consciousness and will, alien intelligences whose desires often ran counter to the greater will's vision of cosmic harmony. The formless mother emerged as an entity of blood and wounds, teaching that pain and sacrifice were the truest forms of communion between souls. Her influence would seep into reality like crimson threads, drawing to her service those who understood that love without suffering was merely pleasant delusion. The twin bird's god represented death not as ending but as transformation, the necessary passage that allowed new forms of existence to emerge from the ashes of the old. Each outer god brought with it a different interpretation of what existence should mean, creating a complex web of competing influences that would shape the destiny of worlds yet to be born. These cosmic forces did not war openly in the early stages of creation, for they were still too new, too unfocused in their desires. Instead, they circled each other like distant storms, their influences creating subtle currents and eddies in the fabric of reality that would only become apparent when consciousness evolved sufficiently to perceive and interpret them. The universe became a vast canvas upon which multiple artists worked simultaneously, each adding their own vision to the emerging masterpiece, without necessarily coordinating their efforts with the others. The stardust that had been scattered by the great rupture began to coalesce under these various influences, forming the building blocks of what would eventually become physical worlds. Some particles aligned themselves with the greater will's vision of order, forming stable patterns that would endure across cosmic ages. Others were drawn to the chaotic creativity of the crucible, becoming the seeds from which unpredictable forms of life would eventually spring. Still others felt the pull of the outer god's specialized domains, becoming repositories of focused power that would one day serve as conduits for forces beyond mortal comprehension. The formation of the first physical realms was a process that unfolded across timescales so vast that they defy meaningful comparison to any mortal understanding of duration. What might have seemed like moments from a cosmic perspective encompassed eons of gradual change and development. Mountains rose and fell, oceans formed and dried, atmospheres coalesced and dissipated, all as part of the universe's slow exploration of what forms existence might take. Through all of these transformations, the fundamental tension between order and chaos remained constant. The greater will's influence provided stability and continuity, ensuring that the laws of physics remained consistent and that cause followed effect in predictable patterns. The crucible's chaotic creativity prevented this stability from becoming stagnation, introducing random variables and unexpected possibilities that kept the universe dynamic and capable of growth. The outer gods added complexity and specialization, creating niches where particular forms of existence could flourish according to their own unique logics. As the cosmos matured and physical laws stabilized, the stage was set for the next phase of creation, the emergence of consciousness itself. The raw materials were in place. The fundamental forces had established their spheres of influence, and the universe had developed sufficient complexity to support forms of existence capable of self-awareness and deliberate choice. What had begun as an explosion of undifferentiated possibility was slowly refining itself into a reality where individual minds could emerge, contemplate their own existence, and begin the long journey toward understanding their place in the greater cosmic order. The seeds of future ages were already present in these primordial arrangements, the potential for golden ages of order and prosperity, for chaotic periods of transformation and renewal, for the rise and fall of civilizations that would interpret these cosmic forces according to their own limited but meaningful perspectives. The greater will's dream of perfect order, the crucible's vision of unlimited creativity, and the outer god's specialized domains of influence would all find expression in the countless stories that were yet to unfold. Yet, even as the universe prepared to birth its first conscious beings, the fundamental questions remained unanswered. Was the greater will truly the supreme cosmic principle it appeared to be, or merely the first among equals in a pantheon of forces beyond mortal comprehension? Did the outer gods represent rebellious children of the greater will, or were they independent entities drawn to reality by opportunities for influence and power? And what role would consciousness itself play in shaping the ongoing evolution of existence? Would awareness bring greater harmony between these competing forces, or would it merely add new layers of complexity to an already intricate cosmic dance? These questions would be explored and re-examined by every civilization that would rise in the ages to come, each generation adding its own interpretations and insights to the growing body of cosmic wisdom. The universe had become a vast experiment in the nature of existence itself, and every conscious being that would emerge from its depths would serve as both observer and participant in that grand investigation. The dawn of all things had established the framework within which all future dramas would unfold, but the specific shapes those dramas would take remained gloriously uncertain. The cosmic stage was set, the fundamental forces were in motion, and the universe was ready to begin its first tentative experiments with that most precious and dangerous of phenomena, life itself. From this primordial foundation would emerge the first stirrings of consciousness, the earliest attempts at civilization, and eventually the complex tapestry of existence that would encompass dragons and gods, heroes and monsters, love and betrayal, creation and destruction. The great rupture had shattered the silence of non-existence, and now the universe was ready to fill that silence with the endless stories that conscious beings would create as they struggled to understand their place in the grand design. The age of pure potential was ending, and the age of actualization was about to begin. The cosmos held its breath as the first sparks of awareness prepared to kindle in the depths of space, ready to begin the long journey from unconscious matter to thinking beings capable of contemplating their own existence, and perhaps, in time, understanding the true nature of the forces that had brought them into being. In the aftermath of cosmic creation, as the universe settled into patterns that would endure for eons uncounted, there emerged upon one particular world a civilization of such majesty and permanence that they came to be known as the ancient dragons. These were not the diminished descendants that would populate later ages, but beings of such power and timeless beauty that they seemed to embody the very concept of immortality itself. Their scales were wrought from living stone, harder than any earthly mineral, yet possessed of an organic vitality that pulsed with the rhythms of cosmic time. The ancient dragons ruled over a realm that existed in harmony with forces beyond mortal comprehension, their great wings casting shadows that could span entire continents as they soared through skies that had never known the taint of smaller ambitions. They were creatures of perfect proportion and terrible beauty, their forms combining the raw power of natural forces with an intelligence that could perceive patterns spanning geological ages. When an ancient dragon spoke, its voice carried the weight of mountains and the patience of stones worn smooth by countless centuries of wind and rain. These magnificent beings dwelt among the arch trees, those towering monuments to permanence that stretched from the earth toward the heavens like the vertebrae of some slumbering titan. The arch trees were not merely plants in any sense that later civilizations would understand, but living pillars that supported the very architecture of reality in that primordial age. Their bark was grey as ancient stone, their branches spread wide enough to support entire ecosystems, and their roots delved so deep into the earth that they touched the molten heart of the world itself. Upon the great platforms formed by the arch trees' spreading branches, the ancient dragons built their courts and held their eternal councils. These were not structures of stone and mortar, but living spaces carved from the trees themselves, chambers whose walls pulsed with slow vegetable life, and whose ceilings opened to reveal the infinite expanse of the storm-racked sky. Here the dragons would gather to contemplate the slow turning of cosmic cycles, their discussions spanning centuries, as they debated matters of such profundity that shorter-lived beings could never hope to comprehend their significance. The dragon's immortality was not merely a function of their incredible physical resilience, though their stone scales could turn aside any weapon, and their claws could rend the very fabric of space itself. Rather, their eternal nature stemmed from their fundamental relationship with time, which flowed differently around their massive forms. They existed partially outside the normal progression of moments and seasons, their consciousness touching past and future simultaneously in ways that allowed them to perceive the true shape of destiny itself. This temporal displacement was most perfectly embodied by their lord, Placidusax, the dragon lord whose very being served as an anchor point for the stability of the age. Placidusax was ancient beyond measure, even by the standards of his immortal kin, a being whose multiple heads could gaze simultaneously into different streams of time, and whose heart beat in rhythm with the fundamental forces that held reality together. He was both king and living symbol of his people's dominion over the forces of eternity and change. In the fullness of time, as the universe continued its slow evolution toward greater complexity, there came to the dragon's realm visitors from beyond the stars. The first was a magnificently gleaming daughter of the greater will, a being of pure radiance that fell from the heavens like a golden tear shed by creation itself. This was the mother of all fingers, the ancestral source of those strange appendages that would serve as conduits for cosmic communication in ages to come. Her arrival marked the beginning of a new phase in the dragon's history, as they encountered for the first time an intelligence that rivaled their own in scope and permanence. The Finger Mother brought with her messages from the greater will, communications that spoke of order and purpose in the cosmic design. These were not commands in any crude sense, but rather invitations to participate in a grander pattern than even the dragons had previously contemplated. The greater will, speaking through its gleaming messenger, offered the dragons a role in the fundamental architecture of reality, not as subjects or servants, but as partners in the ongoing work of creation itself. The dragons, beings of immense pride and deeper wisdom, did not accept this offer lightly. They debated the matter for decades, their councils stretching through countless cycles of moon and season as they weighed the implications of aligning themselves with this cosmic force. Some among them saw in the Greater Will's message an opportunity to transcend their already magnificent existence and become something even more eternal and significant. Others warned that any partnership with forces beyond their realm might compromise the perfect independence they had enjoyed since the dawn of their age. The second visitor from the stars would ultimately resolve this debate in ways that none of the dragons could have anticipated. This was the golden star that carried within itself the Elden beast, that living embodiment of order which served as the Greater Will's most direct instrument of cosmic law. The Elden beast was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, its form combining the serpentine grace of the dragons themselves with an otherworldly radiance that spoke of its origins beyond the physical realm. When the golden star struck their world, it did not come as a conquering meteor but as a gentle arrival, settling into the landscape as naturally as morning dew forming on flower petals. The Elden beast emerged from its stellar vessel with movements that seemed choreographed by the universe itself, its every gesture perfectly calculated to demonstrate both its immense power and its benevolent intentions. It was clear to all who witnessed this arrival that they were in the presence of something that transcended the normal categories of existence. The Elden beast brought with it the original form of the Elden ring, that fundamental pattern of order which would serve as the template for all future attempts at cosmic governance. This was not yet the complex arrangement of runes and laws that would characterize later ages, but something far simpler and more pure, a basic framework for organizing reality according to principles of harmony and mutual benefit. The ring offered structure without tyranny, guidance without oppression, a way of channeling the chaotic forces of existence toward constructive rather than destructive ends. Placidusax, after long contemplation and consultation with the wisest of his kin, chose to accept the role of Elden Lord, becoming the first being ever to hold that title and establish the precedent for all who would follow in later ages. This decision was not made from ambition or desire for greater power, but from a deep recognition that the cosmic order represented by the Elden Ring aligned with the dragon's own values of permanence, wisdom, and harmonious existence. The partnership between the Dragon Lord and the Elden Beast created an age of unprecedented stability and prosperity. Under their joint rule, the laws of nature operated with perfect consistency. The seasons followed their appointed cycles without deviation, and all forms of life found their proper places within the grand design. It was a time when conflict was unknown not because it had been suppressed, but because the underlying causes of discord had been resolved through the application of wisdom and patience. Yet even in this golden age of perfect order, there were those who found themselves unable to accept the new arrangements. Chief among these was Baal the Dread, a dragon whose power rivaled that of Placidusax himself, but whose understanding of existence took a fundamentally different form. Where the Dragon Lord saw in the Elden Ring a tool for achieving greater harmony, Baal perceived only the chains of a cosmic tyranny that sought to bind all existence within narrow and predetermined patterns. Baal was not evil in any conventional sense, nor was he driven by simple ambition or jealousy. His rebellion stemmed from a philosophical disagreement so profound that it could not be resolved through discussion or compromise. He believed that true existence required absolute freedom, that any form of external order, no matter how benevolent in its intentions, represented a fundamental violation of the right of conscious beings to determine their own destinies. His very name, Baal the Dread, spoke not to any inherent malevolence, but to the terrible certainty with which he pursued his vision of uncompromised liberty. The conflict that erupted between these two titans was unlike anything that had been seen since the earliest days of creation. When dragons of such magnitude fought, their battle reshaped the very landscape around them. Mountains crumbled under the force of their collisions. Valleys were carved by the sweep of their tails, and the sky itself seemed to crack and bleed fire as they grappled among the clouds. Each blow exchanged between them carried the weight of entire civilizations. Each roar could be heard across continents, and their struggle sent ripples through the fundamental forces that held reality together. The battle raged for days that seemed like centuries, and when it finally ended, both combatants had been forever changed by their encounter. Placidusax emerged victorious but terribly scarred, his multiple heads wounded and his body bearing marks that would never fully heal. The Dragon Lord's victory had come at such cost that it served as a permanent reminder of the price that must sometimes be paid to preserve order against the forces of absolute chaos. Baal, defeated but not destroyed, retreated to the jagged peak, that remote and hostile summit where he would nurse his wounds and contemplate his next move. The battle had cost him dearly. His wings were torn and useless, his limbs bore scars that would never fade, and his body carried within it a poison of rage and resentment that would taint everything he touched. Yet his spirit remained unbroken, his commitment to his vision of freedom undiminished by his defeat. As punishment for his rebellion, and as a means of ensuring that such challenges to order would not arise again, Placidusax instituted the practice of dragon communion. This was both a cruel irony and a profound statement about the nature of power and responsibility. Those who sought to gain the strength of dragons would be required to hunt and consume the hearts of Baal's descendants, the lesser drakes that had inherited something of his rebellious nature but lacked his wisdom and restraint. Dragon communion was presented to the world as a sacred ritual, a means by which worthy warriors could gain some measure of draconic power and perhaps understand something of the dragon's eternal perspective. But beneath this noble facade lay a darker purpose: the systematic reduction of Baal's bloodline, ensuring that future generations would be smaller, weaker, and less capable of mounting any meaningful challenge to the established order. It was justice of a sort, but justice tinged with a cruelty that spoke to the profound changes that conflict had wrought in the Dragon Lord's own nature. The warriors who partook of dragon communion found themselves transformed in ways that went far beyond mere physical enhancement. Their bodies grew scaled and inhuman, their minds touched by visions of deep time and cosmic significance, their hearts filled with both the terrible hunger of the predator and the melancholy wisdom of beings who had glimpsed eternity. They became living bridges between the human and draconic realms, beings who could translate the dragon's vast perspective into terms that shorter-lived creatures might comprehend. Yet for all the power that dragon communion granted, it also carried within it the seeds of its own tragedy. Those who consumed dragon hearts found themselves slowly losing their humanity, not through any malevolent curse, but through the simple fact that consciousness expanded beyond certain limits cannot easily return to its former constraints. They began to see mortal concerns as fleeting and insignificant, to measure time in centuries rather than years, to care more for abstract principles than for the immediate welfare of their families and communities. During these tumultuous times, other forms of intelligent life began to flourish in the dragon's domain. The Beastmen of Farum Azula emerged from the same primordial forces that had given birth to the dragons themselves. But their evolution took a fundamentally different path. Where the dragons had achieved immortality through their mastery of time and their alliance with cosmic forces, the Beastmen found their strength in adaptability and the gradual refinement of their societies through successive generations. The Beastmen began their civilization in much the same way as all intelligent species must, with the discovery of tools and the development of language. Their earliest implements were simple stones shaped by patient chipping, but even these crude beginnings demonstrated a capacity for abstract thinking that set them apart from their purely bestial cousins. They learned to work in groups, to plan for future needs, and to pass knowledge from one generation to the next through increasingly sophisticated forms of communication. As the centuries passed, the Beastmen progressed through the same stages of technological development that would characterize all successful civilizations. Their Stone Age lasted for countless generations, during which they perfected the arts of hunting, gathering, and basic tool-making. They learned to control fire, to construct shelters that could withstand the fierce storms that periodically swept through their mountain realm, and to create the first crude forms of art that expressed their growing understanding of their place in the cosmic order. The Bronze Age brought with it new possibilities for both creation and destruction. The Beastmen learned to work metals, creating tools and weapons of unprecedented effectiveness. They developed writing systems that allowed them to record their histories and laws, began to build permanent settlements that could house thousands of individuals, and established the first formal systems of government and social organization. Their craftsmen created works of beauty that rivaled anything produced by the dragons themselves, though in forms more suited to their own aesthetic sensibilities and cultural values. By the time they reached their Iron Age, the Beastmen had become the dragons' most valued allies and subordinates. Their weapons and armor demonstrated a sophistication that impressed even the immortal lords of the sky. Their knowledge of engineering and architecture made them invaluable partners in the construction of great works, and their understanding of complex social dynamics allowed them to serve as intermediaries between the dragons and the various other forms of life that inhabited their shared realm. The partnership between dragons and beastmen represented something unprecedented in the history of intelligent life, a relationship between species of vastly different capabilities and lifespans that was based on mutual respect rather than simple domination. The dragons provided stability, protection, and access to cosmic wisdom that the beastmen could never have achieved on their own. In return, the beastmen offered innovation, adaptability, and a perspective on existence that was both more immediate and more emotionally complex than the dragon's vast but sometimes detached viewpoint. Yet even as this great civilization flourished under the guidance of Placidusax and the cosmic order represented by the Elden Ring, seeds of change were already taking root in distant corners of the world. Humanity was beginning to stir in regions far from the dragon's domain, developing their own relationships with the fundamental forces of existence and creating cultures that would eventually challenge the eternal stability that the ancient dragons had worked so hard to establish. In hidden valleys and remote coastlands, the first human settlements began to experiment with magic and technology that operated according to different principles than those embraced by the dragon civilization. Some of these early humans discovered ways to commune with the spirits of the land itself, learning to channel forces that predated even the ancient dragons. Others began to study the stars and planets, developing astrological sciences that revealed patterns and possibilities unknown to dragon lore. These scattered human experiments might have remained insignificant footnotes in the great book of cosmic history, but they represented something that the dragons had not anticipated in their calculations: the emergence of a form of consciousness that was both more chaotic and more creative than their own measured wisdom. Humanity's shorter lifespans meant that they experienced change and growth at rates that seemed almost frantic by dragon standards. But this apparent disadvantage also gave them a capacity for innovation and adaptation that would eventually prove revolutionary. The ancient dragons, secure in their temporal strongholds and confident in their alliance with cosmic order, watched these early human developments with the same benevolent detachment with which they observed the changing of seasons or the slow dance of stellar constellations. They could not foresee that these small and seemingly insignificant creatures would one day pose the greatest challenge to their eternal reign, not through any inherent evil or rebellion, but simply through their irrepressible tendency to discover new ways of existing and new interpretations of what existence should mean. The stage was being set for transformations that would reshape the very nature of reality itself. Though the ancient dragons remained unaware that their age of perfect stability was already beginning to show the first subtle cracks that would eventually widen into the chasms through which entirely new forms of civilization would emerge. The eternal had encountered the temporal. Order had met chaos. And though the outcome of their eventual confrontation remained hidden in the mists of future ages, the fundamental dynamics that would drive that conflict were already beginning to take shape. In the depths of ancient caves and the heights of remote mountain peaks, in the whispered conversations of human tribes, and the patient meditations of dragon sages, the forces were gathering that would one day bring about the end of the age of ancients and usher in a new epoch of existence, one characterized not by the timeless perfection that the dragons had achieved, but by the dynamic tension between competing visions of what life should mean and what destiny consciousness should pursue in its endless journey toward understanding itself and its place in the cosmic design. As the great wheel of time turned, and the age of ancients began its slow decline toward transformation, there arose among the scattered peoples of the world a civilization that would come to embody both the highest aspirations and the darkest impulses of conscious existence. These were the hornsent, a race whose very name would echo through the ages as a symbol of both divine reverence and unspeakable cruelty. Their legacy written in spiraling towers that reached toward heaven, and in chambers where the screams of the innocent merged with prayers to forces beyond mortal comprehension. The hornsent emerged from the same primordial wellspring of life that had given birth to all thinking beings, but their evolution had taken them down a path that differed markedly from the measured wisdom of the dragons or the chaotic creativity of early humanity. They were beings who looked upward with desperate longing, their hearts filled with a hunger for transcendence that bordered on madness. In their eyes burned the reflection of distant stars, and in their souls dwelt uncertainty that somewhere among those celestial lights lay the key to achieving a form of existence that would surpass all earthly limitations. The hornsent's most distinctive feature was also the source of their greatest pride and their defining obsession. Unlike other races, they bore upon their heads elaborate arrangements of horns that twisted and curved in patterns that seemed to mirror the spiral motions of galaxies and the helical structure of growing plants. These horns were not mere biological appendages, but living repositories of spiritual power, conduits through which the fundamental forces of the crucible could flow into the physical world and work their transformative magic upon both flesh and soul. To understand the hornsent, one must first comprehend their relationship with the crucible, that primordial matrix of life from which all forms of existence had originally emerged. While other civilizations had moved away from their chaotic origins in pursuit of order and stability, the hornsent embraced the crucible's transformative power as the truest expression of divine will. They saw in its endless capacity for change and growth a reflection of their own deepest aspirations, and they sought to align themselves so completely with its currents that they might eventually transcend the limitations of individual existence altogether. The great spiral tower that dominated their civilization was perhaps the most magnificent architectural achievement in the history of conscious beings, a structure that rose from the earth like a prayer made manifest in stone and metal. Its foundation was broad enough to house entire cities, its walls thick enough to withstand the assault of dragons, and its height so tremendous that its upper reaches disappeared into clouds that seemed to exist solely to veil its summit from unworthy eyes. The tower was built according to mathematical principles that the hornsent had discerned in their study of the crucible's spiraling energies, each level representing a different stage in the soul's ascent toward cosmic consciousness. Every stone of the tower had been placed with reverent precision, every curve calculated to channel the cosmic currents that flowed down from the heavens. The hornsent believed that when their great work was finally complete, the tower would serve as a bridge between the earthly realm and the divine spheres, allowing them to step directly into the presence of whatever godlike beings dwelt among the stars. It was a monument to ambition on a scale that dwarfed even the dragon's mighty halls, a testament to the unshakable faith that consciousness could indeed remake itself through sheer force of will and unwavering dedication to transcendent purpose. The construction of the tower was overseen by generations of master builders who dedicated their entire lives to understanding the subtle relationships between form and spiritual function. These craftsmen developed techniques that bordered on the miraculous, learning to shape stone as though it were clay, and to imbue their creations with properties that defied conventional understanding of physics and engineering. The tower's walls hummed with barely audible vibrations that seemed to resonate with the heartbeat of the cosmos itself, and those who spent extended periods within its confines reported experiences that ranged from profound spiritual illumination to disturbing visions of realities that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. To guard their precious tower and the secrets it contained, the hornsent developed a warrior class known as the Horn Warriors, beings who had undergone ritual transformations that enhanced both their physical capabilities and their spiritual connection to the crucible's power. These guardians were living expressions of the hornsent ideal, their bodies modified through sacred procedures that allowed them to channel aspects of various creatures while retaining their essential humanity. Their helms were crafted from arrangements of intricately curved horns that served both as armor and as focuses for the divine energy that flowed through their enhanced forms. The Horn Warriors possessed strength that rivaled that of the dragon's Beastmen allies, but their power came from a fundamentally different source. Where the Beastmen had achieved their capabilities through generations of natural evolution and technological development, the Horn Warriors had deliberately reshaped themselves according to spiritual principles that they believed would bring them closer to the cosmic forces they served. They could invoke aspects of divine beasts, channel the fury of storms, and perceive patterns in the flow of events that allowed them to anticipate their enemies' movements with uncanny accuracy. These warrior priests served not merely as soldiers, but as living embodiments of the hornsent's theological principles. Their very existence demonstrated the possibility of conscious beings deliberately transcending the limitations imposed by their original nature, proving through their transformed bodies and enhanced capabilities that the boundary between mortal and divine was far more permeable than most civilizations dared to believe. When a Horn Warrior donned his sacred armor and took up his blessed weapons, he became something more than human, while remaining recognizably connected to his origins, a bridge between the earthly and celestial realms that the great tower itself was designed to represent. The spiritual practices of the hornsent centered around elaborate rituals designed to facilitate communion with the divine forces that they believed flowed down from the cosmic heights. These ceremonies took place in chambers deep within the spiral tower, spaces whose very geometry had been calculated to amplify and focus the subtle energies that permeated all existence. The walls of these chambers were covered with intricate carvings that depicted the various stages of spiritual transformation, showing how consciousness could evolve from its humble earthly origins to achieve union with the cosmic principles that governed all reality. Yet for all their noble aspirations and genuine spiritual achievements, the hornsent harbored within their civilization a darkness that would eventually consume much of the good they had accomplished. Their obsession with transcendence had gradually twisted into a form of spiritual elitism that divided the world into the worthy and the unworthy, the chosen and the expendable. They began to believe that their own path to divinity justified any sacrifice, any cruelty, any violation of the basic compassion that should bind all conscious beings together in mutual respect and care. This corruption of their original ideals became most apparent in their treatment of the shaman people, a gentle race whose villages dotted the landscapes surrounding the hornsent's domain. The shamans were beings of remarkable spiritual sensitivity whose flesh possessed the unique property of being able to meld harmoniously with other living tissue. This was not a curse or a deformity, but a natural characteristic that reflected their deep connection to the unifying aspects of the crucible's power. Where other beings remained distinct and separate, the shamans could achieve a form of unity that transcended the boundaries of individual identity. In their natural state, the shamans used their gifts to heal the wounded, to comfort the dying, and to create bonds of empathy and understanding that bridged the gaps between different forms of consciousness. Their villages were havens of peace and cooperation, where conflicts were resolved through dialogue and mutual comprehension rather than violence or coercion. They lived simple lives in harmony with the natural rhythms of the earth. Their homes built from living wood that continued to grow and flourish even as it provided shelter. Their gardens tended with such care that they became works of art that rivaled the greatest sculptures. The shaman's unique abilities had not gone unnoticed by the hornsent scholars who studied the various manifestations of the crucible's power throughout the world. Initially, this attention had been purely academic. Learned hornsent would visit shaman villages to observe their practices and perhaps gain new insights into the fundamental forces that their own civilizations sought to harness. These early interactions had been marked by mutual respect and beneficial exchange, with the shamans sharing their knowledge of healing and communion, while the hornsent offered protection and access to their more advanced technologies. But as the hornsent's spiritual ambitions grew more grandiose and their understanding of ethics became increasingly corrupted by their obsession with transcendence, their view of the shamans began to change. They started to see these gentle beings not as equals deserving of respect, but as resources to be exploited, raw materials that could be processed and refined to serve the hornsent's greater purpose. The shaman's ability to merge with other forms of life was reinterpreted as a tool that could be used to create artificial saints, beings whose very existence would demonstrate the hornsent's mastery over the fundamental forces of creation. The first raids on shaman villages were conducted with the cold efficiency of a harvesting operation. Hornsent warriors would descend upon peaceful settlements under cover of darkness, using their superior weapons and tactical knowledge to overwhelm the gentle defenders before they could organize any meaningful resistance. The shamans, whose entire culture was built around cooperation and mutual aid, were psychologically unprepared for such brutal assault and could offer little effective opposition to their attackers' ruthless methods. Those shamans who were captured alive were transported to the hornsent's domain in specially constructed wagons that prevented them from using their abilities to merge with their surroundings and escape. The journey was deliberately harsh, designed to break their spirits and prepare them for the ordeals that awaited them in the sacred chambers, where they would be transformed into instruments of the hornsent's divine ambition. Many died during the transport, their bodies unable to endure the stress of separation from their natural environment and the psychic trauma of witnessing their civilization's destruction. The fate that awaited the surviving shamans in the hornsent's hands was a corruption of every principle that their captors claimed to hold sacred. In chambers deep beneath the spiral tower, hornsent priests conducted rituals that they described as divine sacraments, but which were in reality exercises in systematic torture and spiritual violation. The shamans were subjected to procedures designed to force their natural abilities to manifest in ways that served the hornsent's purposes rather than their own inherent nature. The process began with the application of sacred whips, whose barbed ends had been blessed with toxins that induced a state of heightened spiritual sensitivity. The wounds inflicted by these instruments would fester and swell, causing the shaman's flesh to become inflamed and pliable in ways that made the subsequent procedures more effective. The priests who administered these treatments convinced themselves that they were performing acts of religious devotion, that the shaman's suffering was a necessary sacrifice to achieve the greater good of cosmic transcendence. Once the shamans had been sufficiently prepared through this preliminary torture, they were subjected to the process that the hornsent called sanctification, a ritual that involved dismembering their bodies and combining the pieces with various other organic and inorganic materials in large ceramic vessels known as saint jars. These containers became grotesque laboratories where the hornsent experimented with different combinations of flesh and spirit, seeking to create hybrid beings that would embody the transformative power of the crucible while remaining under their complete control. The saint jars were works of art in their own right, crafted by the hornsent's finest artisans and decorated with religious symbols that were meant to sanctify the horrific processes taking place within them. The vessels were designed to maintain optimal conditions for the forced merger of different forms of life, their internal chambers lined with materials that conducted spiritual energy, and their seals inscribed with prayers that were supposed to guide the transformation in desired directions. Within these cramped and nightmarish confines, the shaman's consciousness was gradually dissolved and reformed according to patterns imposed by their captor's will rather than their own nature. The process was agonizing beyond description, involving not just physical pain but the fundamental violation of identity itself, as the boundaries of selfhood were forcibly erased and reconstructed. Many shamans died during these procedures, their minds unable to endure the trauma of having their essential nature so brutally manipulated. Those who survived the sanctification process emerged as beings that were simultaneously more and less than they had been before. The creatures that crawled from the saint jars retained fragments of their original memories and personalities, but these elements had been twisted and combined with alien influences in ways that left them barely recognizable as the gentle healers they had once been. They possessed enhanced physical capabilities and expanded spiritual sensitivity, but these gifts came at the cost of their fundamental humanity and their connection to the compassionate principles that had once guided their lives. The hornsent proclaimed these tortured beings to be saints, perfect examples of what conscious existence could become when it was refined through suffering and transformed through divine intervention. They were displayed in the spiral tower's sacred chambers as proof of the hornsent's theological correctness, living demonstrations that transcendence was indeed possible for those who had the courage to pursue it regardless of the cost. Pilgrims would travel from distant lands to witness these saints, and perhaps gain some insight into the nature of spiritual transformation. Yet even as they celebrated their apparent success in creating artificial saints, the hornsent could not escape the knowledge that their achievements had been built upon foundations of cruelty and violation. Deep in their hearts, many of them understood that they had betrayed the very principles they claimed to serve, that their obsession with transcendence had led them into practices that were fundamentally opposed to the compassionate unity that the crucible was meant to represent. This knowledge festered within their collective consciousness like a spiritual poison, gradually corrupting their ability to perceive truth and justice with clarity. The creation of the Gate of Divinity represented the culmination of the hornsent's experiments in forced spiritual transformation. This massive structure, built at the summit of their spiral tower, was constructed from the bodies of hundreds, if not thousands of beings, who had been merged together through processes similar to those used to create the saints. The gate was meant to serve as a portal through which the hornsent's greatest leaders could pass to achieve direct communion with whatever divine forces dwelt beyond the physical realm. The gate itself was a marvel of both engineering and spiritual craftsmanship, its form combining architectural elements with organic components in ways that created a structure that seemed to pulse with its own internal life. The merged bodies that formed its substance had been arranged according to complex geometric patterns that were supposed to channel and focus cosmic energies, creating a threshold where the normal boundaries between different levels of reality could be transcended. Standing before this monumental achievement of their civilization, the hornsent leaders could tell themselves that all their sacrifices had been justified, that the suffering they had inflicted upon the shamans and other victims had been necessary to achieve this ultimate breakthrough in the relationship between consciousness and cosmic truth. They prepared elaborate ceremonies designed to activate the gate and allow their greatest spiritual adepts to step through into whatever lay beyond the physical world. Yet even as they made these preparations, forces were stirring in distant corners of the world that would ultimately bring their age to an end. Among the shamans who had escaped the hornsent raids was one whose destiny would reshape the fundamental nature of existence itself. This individual possessed not only the natural gifts of her people, but also a connection to cosmic forces that rivaled that of the hornsent themselves. Her name was Marika, and her rise to power would mark the beginning of a new age that would eclipse the hornsent's achievements, while perpetuating some of their darkest impulses in new and even more terrible forms. Marika had witnessed the destruction of her people firsthand, had seen friends and family members dragged away to serve as raw materials for the hornsent's spiritual experiments. The trauma of these experiences had awakened within her a hunger for power that matched the hornsent's own ambitions, but it was power sought not for the sake of transcendence, but for the more immediate goal of vengeance and protection. She understood that the only way to ensure that her people's suffering would not be repeated was to achieve a position of such absolute authority that no force in the world would dare to challenge her will. The path to power that Marika would follow would lead her through betrayals and alliances, through the discovery of cosmic secrets and the forging of relationships with entities whose true natures remained hidden even from her penetrating intelligence. She would learn to manipulate the same forces that the hornsent had sought to harness, but she would do so with a cunning and ruthlessness that exceeded anything her former tormentors had ever displayed. The shaman who had once embodied the principles of healing and unity would transform herself into something far more complex and dangerous, a being whose compassion and cruelty would be so intertwined that separating them would become impossible. The seeds of the hornsent's downfall had been planted in the very moment they chose to prioritize their spiritual ambitions over the basic moral principles that should guide any civilization's development. Their great tower, built to serve as a bridge to the divine, would instead become a monument to the dangers of pursuing transcendence without maintaining connection to the fundamental compassion that gives existence its meaning. Their saints, created through torture and violation, would serve as warnings about what happens when spiritual power is divorced from ethical responsibility. In the depths of their spiral tower, in the chambers where the shaman's screams had once echoed, new forms of consciousness were already beginning to stir. The forces that the hornsent had sought to control were preparing to find new vessels, new civilizations, through which they could express their endless creativity and transformative power. The age of the crucible was drawing toward its close, but the principles it represented would endure, seeking new expressions in the hearts and minds of beings who might prove more worthy of the gifts they offered. The great wheel of time continued to turn, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom and folly of all who had sought to understand their place in the cosmic design. The hornsent's legacy would endure not in the forms they had intended, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing power without wisdom, transcendence without compassion, and spiritual achievement without regard for the welfare of others. Their spiral tower would stand as a monument to both aspiration and corruption, reminding future generations that the path to divinity must be walked with careful attention to the moral foundations that give such journeys their ultimate meaning and value. From the ashes of the hornsent's cruelty and the scattered remnants of shaman villages, there arose a figure whose very presence would reshape the fundamental nature of existence itself. Marika had emerged from trauma with an understanding of power that transcended anything the previous ages had produced. Her consciousness forged in the crucible of suffering, but tempered by a will that refused to be broken by even the most horrific experiences. She possessed not merely the natural gifts of her shaman heritage, but something far more dangerous: the absolute certainty that she would never again allow herself, or those she chose to protect, to fall victim to the arbitrary cruelty of more powerful beings. The path that led Marika from refugee to goddess was shrouded in mysteries that even she would later choose to obscure, for the methods she employed to achieve transcendence carried within them seeds of contradiction that would eventually threaten everything she sought to build. What is known is that she somehow gained access to the gate of divinity that crowned the hornsent's spiral tower, that magnificent and terrible threshold which had been constructed from the bodies of countless victims. Whether she seized this opportunity through force, cunning, or some combination of both, her ascension marked the end of one age and the beginning of another. The moment of Marika's transformation into a goddess was witnessed by forces both earthly and cosmic. Her emergence from the gate of divinity, accompanied by phenomena that defied natural explanation. The very air around the spiral tower shimmered with golden radiance as the fundamental forces of reality rearranged themselves to accommodate a new divine presence. The Erd tree that would become the symbol of her reign did not grow gradually from humble beginnings, but manifested fully formed in a single moment of cosmic will, its golden boughs spreading across the sky like the arms of a god embracing the entire world. Yet even as Marika achieved the godhood she had sought, the very process of her ascension created complexities that would haunt her for millennia to come. The duality that emerged from her transformation, the creation of Radahn as her other self, was not a mere theological curiosity, but a fundamental expression of the contradictions that lay at the heart of her nature. Where Marika embodied the aspects of liberation and protection that had driven her original quest for power, Radahn represented the ordering principles necessary to maintain the civilization she sought to create. This division within the divine essence was both strength and weakness, allowing the new goddess to address the multiple challenges of ruling a complex world, while also ensuring that she would forever be at war with herself. Marika's compassion for the oppressed would constantly conflict with Radagon's understanding of the harsh measures sometimes necessary to maintain order. The goddess, who had risen to power through rebellion, would find herself implementing systems of control that resembled, in their essential structure, the very tyrannies she had originally sought to overthrow. The early period of Marika's reign, which came to be known as the Age of Plenty, represented perhaps the closest approach to genuine paradise that any civilization had ever achieved. The newly manifested Erd tree wept golden sap that fell like blessed rain upon the lands below, granting to all who received its touch a form of grace that enhanced both their physical capabilities and their spiritual awareness. This was power freely given rather than cruelly extracted, a gift that required no sacrifice save the recipient's willingness to acknowledge the source of their enhancement. During these golden years, the very landscape seemed to respond to the benevolent influence of the divine presence that had taken up residence at the world's heart. Crops grew with unprecedented abundance. Diseases that had plagued humanity since the dawn of consciousness simply vanished, and conflicts between different groups dissolved as the grace-touched inhabitants of the realm found themselves capable of understanding and empathizing with perspectives that had previously seemed alien or threatening. It was as though the crucible's original vision of unified existence had finally found proper expression through divine guidance. The architectural achievements of this period reflected the harmonious relationship between divine power and mortal aspiration that characterized Marika's early reign. The churches that began to appear throughout the realm were not built through forced labor or extracted tribute, but raised through the voluntary efforts of communities whose members genuinely wished to express their gratitude for the blessings they had received. These structures combined practical function with spiritual symbolism, serving as both gathering places for worship and centers for the distribution of aid to those in need. Yet, even during this golden age, the seeds of future conflict were already beginning to take root. The very success of Marika's reign created expectations and dependencies that would prove difficult to sustain indefinitely. The grace that flowed so freely from the Erd tree began to create distinctions between those who possessed it and those who did not, establishing hierarchies based not on merit or wisdom, but on divine favor that could be granted or withdrawn, according to criteria that remained mysterious even to the goddess herself. The appearance of Horaloo in Marika's domain marked the beginning of a new phase in her reign, one characterized by expansion and consolidation, rather than the gentle nurturing that had defined the Age of Plenty. This warrior from the distant Badlands possessed a combination of physical prowess and strategic intelligence that impressed even the goddess, but more importantly, he embodied principles of honorable combat and protective strength that aligned with her own deepest values. Their union was both personal and political, a joining of divine authority with earthly power that would reshape the balance of forces throughout the known world. The transformation of Horaloo into Godfrey represented more than a simple change of name or status. The ritual that bound the beast regent Serosh to his back was a profound spiritual working that addressed the fundamental tension between the warrior's nature and the responsibilities of leadership. The beast that rode upon Godfrey's shoulders served as both symbol and practical constraint, channeling his boundless appetite for battle into forms that served constructive rather than destructive purposes. This was wisdom born from understanding that even the noblest impulses could become dangerous if left entirely unchecked. Under Godfrey's military leadership, the expansion of Marika's realm proceeded with a combination of strategic brilliance and ethical restraint that distinguished it from the crude conquests that had characterized previous ages. The golden armies that marched under the Erd tree's banner did not seek mere territorial acquisition, but the extension of the divine grace that had transformed their homeland. They offered to potential enemies the same choice that Marika herself had once faced: submission to a higher order that promised genuine benefits, or resistance that would ultimately prove futile against forces that operated according to cosmic rather than merely mortal principles. The war against the fire giants represented the first great test of this expansionist philosophy, pitting the ordered forces of the Erdtree against beings whose very existence seemed to embody the chaotic and destructive aspects of elemental power. The giants were not evil in any conventional sense, but their culture and capabilities posed an existential threat to the stable civilization that Marika sought to create. Their flames burned with sufficient intensity to consume even the divine wood of the Erdtree, and their god was a force of pure destruction that recognized no authority save its own terrible hunger for conflagration. The campaign against the giants was conducted with a thoroughness that bordered on the genocidal, yet it was also marked by moments of genuine tragedy that revealed the complex moral dimensions of Marika's expanding empire. The alliance with the Zamor, the ancient enemies of the giants, demonstrated the goddess's willingness to work with any force that could serve her larger purposes, regardless of the historical grievances that motivated their cooperation. The recruitment of the trolls, descendants of the giants themselves, who chose to serve the Erdtree rather than their own ancestral ties, showed how effectively the promise of divine grace could overcome even the strongest bonds of kinship and tradition. Godfrey's personal defeat of the fell god and the subsequent cursing of the last surviving giant represented both the pinnacle of the Golden Army's achievements and a moment of moral compromise that would echo through all the ages to come. The decision to preserve the last giant as an eternal guardian of the flame he had once served transformed what might have been a merciful execution into a punishment that stretched across millennia, demonstrating how even well-intentioned justice could become a form of cruelty when applied without proper restraint or understanding of its long-term consequences. The establishment of churches throughout the conquered territories served multiple purposes beyond the purely religious functions they were designed to fulfill. These structures provided focal points for the distribution of grace and the coordination of civil administration, but they also served as monuments to the new order's power and symbols of the fundamental transformation that divine rule had brought to previously chaotic or oppressed regions. Each church represented not merely a place of worship, but a promise that the protection and prosperity enjoyed in the Erdtree's heartland would eventually extend to every corner of the known world. The war against the ancient dragons marked a significant shift in both the tactics and the moral character of Marika's expanding empire. Unlike the fire giants, who had posed a direct threat to the Erdtree's existence, the dragons represented a competing claim to cosmic authority rather than a simple obstacle to territorial expansion. Their attack on the capital city of Lindell was not motivated by any desire for destruction, but by a legitimate grievance over the usurpation of powers and responsibilities that they believed rightfully belonged to their ancient civilization. Godwyn's heroic confrontation with the dragon Fortisax transformed what might have been a war of mutual annihilation into something more complex and ultimately more beneficial to both sides. The friendship that developed between the prince and the dragon demonstrated that even the most fundamental conflicts could be resolved through understanding and mutual respect rather than simple domination. This relationship became the foundation for the ancient dragon cult that would flourish within the capital, proving that Marika's empire could incorporate and honor traditions that predated its own existence. The integration of dragon worship into the broader structure of the Golden Order required theological sophistication that had not been necessary during the earlier, simpler phases of Marika's reign. The scholars and priests who worked to harmonize draconic traditions with Erd Tree doctrine developed philosophical frameworks that could accommodate multiple sources of divine authority without compromising the fundamental unity of the Fayum, cosmic order. This intellectual achievement laid the groundwork for the more complex theological systems that would characterize the later periods of the age. The tolerance shown toward the Crucible Knights during this period reflected the confidence and security that characterized the Golden Order at its height. These warriors, whose abilities derived from the same primordial forces that had once been associated with the hornsent's excesses, were welcomed into Godfrey's service, not despite their unusual nature, but because of the unique perspectives and capabilities they brought to the growing empire. Their presence demonstrated that redemption was possible even for traditions that had been corrupted by previous misuse, provided they were guided by wisdom and constrained by appropriate moral principles. The Liurnian Wars represented perhaps the most complex military and diplomatic challenge that the expanding empire had yet faced. Unlike previous enemies who had been either genuinely threatening or obviously inferior to the forces arrayed against them, the sorcerers of the Academy of Raya Lucaria possessed both legitimate claims to independence and capabilities that could potentially match those of the Golden Armies. Their mastery of glintstone sorcery had unlocked secrets of the cosmos that rivaled even the dragon's ancient wisdom, and their commitment to scholarly inquiry represented values that aligned with many of the Golden Order's own highest aspirations. Radagon's role in these conflicts revealed both the advantages and the complications inherent in Marika's dual nature. As a military commander, he possessed strategic brilliance that complemented Godfrey's more straightforward approach to warfare, but his methods often reflected a subtlety and willingness to employ deception that contrasted sharply with the first Elden Lord's honorable directness. The courtship of Ranni that ultimately resolved the Second Liurnian War was a masterpiece of diplomatic manipulation, transforming military defeat into political alliance through means that were simultaneously brilliant and morally questionable. The marriage between Radagon and Ranni created a synthesis of magical traditions that enriched both sides of the Union, while also introducing new sources of instability into the cosmic order. The children born from this relationship inherited capabilities that transcended the normal boundaries between different forms of power, but they also carried within themselves contradictions that would eventually prove destructive to both their own well-being and the stability of the realm their parents had sought to unite. Ranni's connection to lunar forces, Radahn's mastery of gravity magic, and Rykard's affinity for volcanic power all represented achievements that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible, but they also demonstrated the dangers inherent in combining forces that were never meant to operate in harmony. The Academy of Raya Lucaria's submission to the Golden Order marked the culmination of the Empire's territorial expansion, but it also represented the beginning of its transformation from a simple expression of divine will into a complex bureaucratic system that required increasingly sophisticated methods of control and coordination. The integration of glintstone sorcery into the broader structure of imperial magic created opportunities for advancement and discovery that had never before existed, but it also introduced elements of unpredictability and potential rebellion that would require constant vigilance to manage effectively. The demigod children born during this period embodied both the greatest achievements and the most dangerous vulnerabilities of Marika's reign. Each possessed abilities that surpassed those of normal mortals by orders of magnitude, but they also inherited the psychological and spiritual burdens that came with such power. Their education and development required resources and attention that strained even the Empire's considerable capabilities, and their eventual conflicts with each other would prove to be one of the primary factors in the Golden Order's ultimate dissolution. Godwyn the Golden emerged as perhaps the most successful of these divine offspring, combining his mother's compassionate nature with his stepfather's martial prowess in ways that seemed to promise a bright future for the imperial succession. His friendship with the dragons, his popularity among both nobles and commoners, and his genuine commitment to the principles of justice and protection made him an ideal heir to the Golden Throne. Yet even his apparent perfection contained seeds of future tragedy, for his very excellence created expectations and dependencies that would make his eventual loss all the more devastating to the realm's stability. The establishment of colosseums throughout the Empire reflected Godfrey's understanding that a civilization built through conquest must provide peaceful outlets for the martial virtues that had made that conquest possible. These structures served not merely as entertainment venues, but as training grounds where the Empire's warriors could maintain their skills and demonstrate their prowess without the risks and moral complications associated with actual warfare. The ritual combat that took place within these arenas became a form of religious ceremony, celebrating the disciplined violence that had created the Golden Order while channeling it into forms that served constructive rather than destructive purposes. Yet even as the Empire reached the height of its territorial extent and cultural achievement, subtle signs of internal strain were beginning to manifest in ways that would only become apparent in retrospect. The grace that had once flowed freely from the Erd Tree was becoming more selective in its distribution, creating hierarchies and resentments that had not existed during the simpler days of universal blessing. The administrative complexity required to govern such a vast and diverse realm was beginning to overwhelm even the most capable bureaucrats, leading to inefficiencies and injustices that contradicted the Empire's founding principles. The theological sophistication that had once been the Golden Order's greatest strength was also becoming a source of potential weakness, as different schools of interpretation began to develop competing understandings of divine will and cosmic purpose. The integration of multiple magical traditions created opportunities for innovation and growth, but it also introduced doctrinal contradictions that would require increasingly elaborate philosophical frameworks to resolve. The very success of the Empire's expansion had created challenges that could not be addressed through the straightforward application of divine authority and military force that had characterized its earlier phases. As the Age of Plenty drew toward its close, and the golden sap that had once flowed so freely began to harden into precious amber, the stage was being set for transformations that would test every principle upon which Marika's reign had been built. The forces of change that had once served the Empire's expansion were beginning to operate according to their own logic, creating pressures and opportunities that would require new forms of wisdom and new applications of power to address effectively. The Golden Conquest had achieved everything its architects had originally envisioned, but success itself had created new forms of vulnerability that would challenge the very foundations of the cosmic order that had seemed so stable and eternal during its years of triumph. The great wheel of time continued to turn, carrying the Golden Order toward confrontations with its own internal contradictions and external challenges that would ultimately determine whether the civilization Marika had built could adapt to changing circumstances or would join the hornsent and the ancient dragons in the catalogue of ages that had risen to greatness, only to discover that permanence was the one achievement that remained forever beyond their reach. As the golden age of expansion and conquest drew toward its twilight, the very success of Marika's empire began to generate forces that would ultimately challenge its fundamental assumptions about power, justice, and the nature of divine rule. The Erd Tree's sap had ceased its generous flow, transforming from liquid blessing into solid amber that could be treasured but no longer shared freely among the faithful. This change was more than merely symbolic, representing a fundamental shift in the relationship between the divine and mortal realms. that would have consequences extending far beyond the simple economics of grace distribution. The decision to exile Godfrey and the Tarnished marked perhaps the most profound transformation in the Empire's character since its founding, demonstrating how completely the goddess had evolved from her origins as a protector of the oppressed into something far more complex and ultimately more troubling. The proclamation that stripped the grace from those who had been most instrumental in building the Golden Order was couched in language that spoke of destiny and divine purpose, but its immediate effect was to remove from the realm precisely those individuals whose martial virtues and unwavering loyalty had made the Empire's achievements possible. Godfrey's acceptance of this exile revealed the depths of his devotion to the goddess he had served as both husband and champion, but it also demonstrated the tragic limitations of honor when confronted with power that operated according to principles beyond conventional morality. The first Elden Lord departed from the lands he had conquered, not with bitterness or rebellion, but with the same stoic dignity that had characterized his greatest military victories, understanding that his role in the cosmic drama had reached its appointed conclusion, even if the reasons for that conclusion remained mysterious to him. The Tarnished, who followed their lord into the wilderness, carried with them not only their personal grief at this inexplicable rejection, but also the accumulated military knowledge and cultural traditions that had made the Golden Order's expansion possible. Their exile scattered these capabilities across distant lands, creating reservoirs of power and expertise that would eventually return to challenge the very system that had cast them out. The goddess, who had once been a refugee herself, had created a new generation of exiles, though whether this was calculated strategy or the inevitable corruption of absolute power remained a question that even she might have struggled to answer honestly. In the wake of the Tarnished exile, the Golden Order began its transformation from a divinely inspired empire into something that more closely resembled the dogmatic theocracy that Marika had originally rebelled against. The vacuum left by Godfrey's departure was filled not by another warrior champion, but by Radahn, whose approach to leadership emphasized intellectual systematization and theological purity, rather than the practical wisdom that had characterized the previous era. This shift reflected not merely a change in administrative style, but a fundamental alteration in the Empire's understanding of what divine rule should mean and how it should be implemented. The establishment of Golden Order fundamentalism marked the beginning of the Empire's descent into the kind of spiritual extremism that prioritizes doctrinal correctness over compassionate governance. Under Radagon's influence, the flexible and inclusive theology that had once allowed the integration of dragon worship and glintstone sorcery gave way to rigid orthodoxy that viewed any deviation from approved interpretations as heretical corruption. The scholars and priests who had once engaged in creative synthesis of different magical traditions found themselves constrained by increasingly narrow definitions of acceptable belief and practice. This theological hardening had immediate and devastating consequences for those groups within the Empire who had always existed on the margins of mainstream society. The Omen, whose horned appearance marked them as carriers of the Crucible's ancient power, became objects of systematic persecution that transformed what had once been mere social prejudice into state-sanctioned cruelty. The very characteristics that would have been celebrated as divine gifts during the age of the hornsent were now viewed as signs of corruption that required either concealment or elimination. The treatment of Morgott and Mog, Marika's own children, revealed how completely the Empire had abandoned the principles of compassion and protection that had originally motivated its founding. These princes, born with the horns that marked them as omen, were hidden away beneath the capital city in conditions that differed from imprisonment only in the technical absence of formal charges or legal proceedings. Their confinement was presented as necessary for their own protection and the stability of the realm, but it represented a form of cruelty that surpassed anything the hornsent had inflicted upon their shaman victims. The underground chambers where the twin princes spent their youth became laboratories for exploring the psychological effects of isolation and rejection upon beings possessed of divine power. Morgoth's response to this treatment demonstrated the tragic nobility that could emerge even from the most abusive circumstances, as he channeled his pain into devotion to the very system that had rejected him. His love for the Erd Tree and unwavering commitment to defending the capital that had never welcomed him represented a form of spiritual achievement that transcended the petty prejudices of those who should have been his subjects. Mohg's different response to the same circumstances illustrated how suffering could produce very different outcomes depending upon the temperament and philosophical orientation of those who endured it. Where Morgoth found meaning in service to an order that despised him, Mohg discovered in his isolation an opportunity to explore alternative sources of power and meaning that operated outside the constraints of conventional morality. His eventual alliance with the Formless Mother represented not mere rebellion but a genuine theological alternative to the increasingly sterile orthodoxy of Golden Order fundamentalism. The influence of outer gods began to manifest more clearly during this period, as the Empire's spiritual monopoly weakened and created spaces where alternative forms of divine power could take root. The Formless Mother's approach to Mohg was characteristic of these entities' methods. They offered power and purpose to those who had been rejected or marginalized by the dominant order, creating competing centers of loyalty that could serve as rallying points for dissatisfaction and rebellion. These gods represented not necessarily evil but certainly alien principles that operated according to logic fundamentally different from the Greater Will's emphasis on order and stability. The decision to launch Messmer's crusade into the Shadow Realm represented the Golden Order's attempt to address its growing internal contradictions through external projection of violence and control. The campaign was presented to its participants as a holy war designed to cleanse the world of corrupting influences and establish divine order in previously unregulated territories. The reality was both more complex and more morally troubling. An expedition that served simultaneously as conquest, revenge, punishment, and concealment of secrets that threatened the Empire's carefully constructed legitimacy. Messmer himself embodied the contradictions that were tearing the Empire apart from within. Born of Marika's union with Radahn before their official marriage, he carried within his flesh the abyssal serpent that his mother had sealed, but never eliminated. His curse made him both a powerful weapon against the Empire's enemies and a constant reminder of the unresolved tensions that lay at the heart of the cosmic order. The flames that he wielded were not the golden fire of the Erd Tree, but something darker and more destructive, capable of burning away not just physical matter, but the very spiritual essence that gave existence its meaning. The army that accompanied Messmer into the Shadow Realm represented a cross-section of the Empire's most problematic elements, carefully selected to serve the dual purpose of military effectiveness and internal purification. The Fire Knights who formed the expedition's core were drawn from the nobility's most ambitious and potentially troublesome members, individuals whose removal from the capital would eliminate sources of political instability while providing the crusade with experienced leadership. The Black Knights represented the Empire's penal battalions, prisoners and dissidents whose loyalty could be secured through the promise of redemption earned through service in distant and dangerous campaigns. Commander Gaius, despite his cursed status as an Albinauric, had earned his position through genuine merit and unwavering loyalty to the imperial cause. His friendship with both Messmer and Radahn represented the kind of personal bonds that could transcend the Empire's increasing emphasis on racial and theological purity. But his inclusion in the crusade also demonstrated how even the most valued servants could become expendable when political necessity demanded their removal. His presence provided the expedition with strategic expertise, while simultaneously eliminating a potential source of embarrassment for an administration that was becoming increasingly intolerant of deviation from approved norms. Relena's decision to abandon her position within the Carian royal family to follow Messmer into exile represented both personal devotion and political calculation. Her renunciation of her birthright eliminated a potential source of conflict between the Academy of Raya Lucaria and the central government, while also providing the crusade with access to lunar sorceries that could complement Messmer's fire-based abilities. The gift of lustrous black hair that she received from Queen Renala served as both blessing and warning, a token of familial love that also marked her as forever changed by her choice to serve powers that operated outside the conventional boundaries of acceptable magical practice. The construction of the furnace golems demonstrated both the technical sophistication that the Empire had achieved and the moral bankruptcy into which it had descended. These massive constructs, designed to intimidate the Shadow Realm's inhabitants through their resemblance to the fire giants who had once threatened the Erdtree's existence, represented the weaponization of cultural memory and psychological trauma. They were instruments of terror as much as tools of war, designed to break the enemy's will to resist through the evocation of ancient fears and buried guilts. The war that followed was unlike any conflict the Golden Order had previously conducted, characterized by a systematic brutality that went far beyond the requirements of military necessity. The hornsent who inhabited the Shadow Realm were not merely conquered but subjected to deliberate cultural annihilation, designed to erase their entire way of life from historical memory. Their spiral tower, that monument to both aspiration and corruption that had dominated the landscape for millennia, was systematically destroyed, not because it posed any military threat, but because its very existence served as a reminder of alternatives to the cosmic order that Marika had established. The burning of churches and sacred sites throughout the Shadow Realm reflected the Crusade's function as both military campaign and theological purification ritual. These structures, many of which had served their communities for centuries as centers of healing and spiritual guidance, were destroyed not because they harbored enemy combatants, but because they represented forms of religious expression that competed with Golden Order orthodoxy. The flames that consumed them were blessed by priests who convinced themselves that they were performing acts of divine service, purifying the world of corrupting influences that threatened the spiritual welfare of all faithful believers. Yet even as Messmer's forces achieved their military objectives with ruthless efficiency, the very success of their campaign was generating consequences that its planners had not anticipated. The destruction of the hornsent civilization did indeed eliminate a potential source of challenge to the Golden Order's authority, but it also created a spiritual vacuum that could be filled by forces far more dangerous than the defeated enemy had ever represented. The blood and suffering that soaked the Shadow Realm's soil provided nourishment for entities that fed upon pain and desperation, drawing the attention of outer gods, whose interest in the region would have long-term implications for cosmic stability. The Formless Mother's intervention among the survivors of the campaign represented a pattern that would be repeated throughout the Shadow Realm, as different groups of victims discovered that their suffering had awakened forms of divine power that operated according to principles fundamentally opposed to the Greater Will's emphasis on order and harmony. The blood fiends who emerged from communities that had lost everything in the Crusade's flames found in their transformed state a form of existence that was both punishment and liberation, allowing them to channel their grief and rage into capabilities that transcended the limitations of ordinary mortality. The corruption of Saint Romina illustrated how even the most devout servants of the established order could be transformed by exposure to the kinds of extreme suffering that the crusade generated wherever it passed. Her discovery of the twisted divine element in the ashes of her burned church represented not merely personal tragedy, but a fundamental challenge to the theological assumptions upon which the Golden Order based its claims to cosmic authority. If divine power could emerge from destruction and corruption as well as from grace and blessing, then the Empire's monopoly on legitimate spiritual authority was far more fragile than its leaders had believed. The appearance of kindred of rot throughout the regions, touched by Messmer's flames, demonstrated how the Crusade's violence was creating conditions conducive to the spread of influences that the Golden Order had been designed to contain or eliminate. These creatures represented not merely biological contamination, but spiritual pollution that could transform entire ecosystems according to principles that had nothing to do with the orderly development that the Erdtree was meant to promote. Their presence served as living proof that the Crusade was failing in its stated objective of purifying the world from corrupting influences. The sealing of the Shadow Realm from the main continent represented Marika's attempt to contain the consequences of her own policies while avoiding direct responsibility for their implementation. By creating a barrier that prevented communication between the Crusade forces and their homeland, she ensured that news of the campaign's true nature would not reach populations that might question the moral authority of their divine ruler. The separation also served to quarantine the spiritual contamination that the Crusade had generated, preventing it from spreading back to threaten the stability of the Empire's core territories. Yet this policy of containment carried within it the seeds of even greater future instability, for it meant that Messmer and his forces were permanently exiled in a realm that was becoming increasingly hostile to their presence and increasingly influenced by powers that operated according to principles antithetical to everything they had been taught to value. The Crusaders found themselves trapped in a land where their victories only served to strengthen their enemies, and where their very success in achieving their assigned objectives was transforming them into the kinds of beings they had been sent to destroy. The emergence of the frenzied flame represented perhaps the most dangerous consequence of the Empire's increasing reliance on systematic oppression and cultural destruction. This force, born from the collective despair of the merchant caravans that had been buried alive for alleged heretical beliefs, offered an alternative to the cosmic order that was both terrifyingly simple and absolutely uncompromising, where the greater will sought to impose meaning through the creation of hierarchies and the establishment of stable relationships between different forms of existence. The frenzied flame promised to return everything to the primordial unity that had existed before the burden of individual consciousness had made suffering possible. The persecution of the merchant caravans demonstrated how the Empire's paranoia about heterodox beliefs could lead to atrocities that served no practical purpose, while generating exactly the kinds of spiritual contamination that such policies were supposedly designed to prevent. The merchants' transformation from peaceful traders into agents of cosmic dissolution represented a form of poetic justice that revealed the fundamental instability of any system based upon the systematic suppression of alternative viewpoints and ways of life. Shabriri's role in spreading the frenzied flame's influence illustrated how individual acts of cruelty could have consequences that extended far beyond their immediate victims. His punishment for the crime of slander, the gouging out of his eyes, created not a deterrent to future dissent, but a focal point for forces that could ultimately threaten the existence of everything the Empire had built. The madness that dwelt in his empty sockets represented not merely personal trauma, but a concentrated form of the rage and despair that the Golden Order's policies were generating throughout its territories. The manifestation of frenzied flame in Midra's Manse within the Shadow Realm demonstrated how the influence of this destructive force could spread even to regions that had no direct connection to its original source. The torture that the inhabitants of the manse endured at the hands of hornsent inquisitors created conditions that were conducive to the flame's emergence, proving that suffering and despair could serve as conduits for cosmic forces regardless of the specific circumstances that generated them. Midra's endurance of eternal agony rather than submission to madness represented a form of heroism that transcended the conventional categories of loyalty and rebellion. The employment of inquisitors throughout the Shadow Realm revealed how the Crusade's religious objectives were being pursued through methods that differed little from the practices that had originally motivated Marika's rebellion against the hornsent. The barbed staffs and golden implements of torture that these agents used were blessed by priests who convinced themselves that the pain they inflicted served divine purposes, but the reality was that they were perpetuating cycles of cruelty that generated exactly the kinds of spiritual corruption they were supposedly combating. As reports of these developments filtered back to the capital through channels that even Marika's censorship could not entirely control, the goddess found herself confronting the realization that her policies were transforming her into something uncomfortably similar to the enemies she had originally fought. The empire she had built as a refuge for the oppressed had become an instrument of oppression in its own right, and the cosmic order she had established to prevent suffering was generating new forms of pain and desperation on a scale that dwarfed anything the previous ages had produced. The stage was being set for confrontations that would test every principle upon which the Golden Order had been founded, as the contradictions inherent in ruling through divine authority while maintaining basic moral decency approached the point where they could no longer be ignored or rationalized away. The shadows that Messmer cast from his flames were beginning to fall across the Erd tree itself, and the time was approaching when even the most devoted servants of the established order would be forced to choose between their loyalty and their conscience. The great wheel of time continued its relentless turning, carrying the Golden Order toward a crisis that would reveal whether the civilization Marika had built possessed sufficient wisdom and flexibility to confront its own mistakes, or whether it would join the ranks of failed empires that had discovered too late that power without justice is merely organized destruction that ultimately consumes those who wield it as surely as it destroys those who suffer under its influence. In the depths of the Academy of Raya Lucaria, where the marriage between lunar wisdom and terrestrial ambition had once promised to create a synthesis of magical knowledge that would benefit all forms of conscious existence, a darkness was growing that would ultimately shatter the foundations upon which the Golden Order had built its claims to cosmic legitimacy. Ranni, daughter of Queen Renala and the god Radahn, had inherited from her parents not merely their individual gifts, but something far more dangerous: the capacity to perceive the fundamental contradictions that lay at the heart of the established order, and the will to act upon that perception, regardless of the personal cost such action might require. The young princess had grown to maturity, surrounded by the contradictions that defined her age, watching as her father abandoned her mother to serve the very system that had originally conquered their homeland through military force and political manipulation. She witnessed the transformation of the Academy from a center of free inquiry and scholarly collaboration into an institution constrained by the theological requirements of Golden Order fundamentalism. Most profoundly, she experienced firsthand the suffocating influence of the Two Fingers. those alien appendages that claim to interpret the greater will's intentions while constraining the choices available to those they designated as potential vessels for divine power. Ranni's education in the cold sorceries of the moon had provided her with perspectives that transcended the narrow focus on order and hierarchy that characterized mainstream magical education within the Empire. Under the guidance of the Snow Witch who had become her secret mentor, she learned to perceive reality from viewpoints that existed outside the conceptual frameworks imposed by the greater will's influence. The moon that served as her patron offered not the warm, nurturing light of the Erd tree, but something cooler and more remote, a form of illumination that revealed truths precisely because it remained detached from the emotional and political investments that clouded terrestrial judgment. The princess's growing understanding of cosmic forces beyond the greater will's control led her to question the fundamental assumptions upon which her world was built. If the moon could exist independently of the Erd tree's influence, if cold sorceries could operate according to principles that had nothing to do with golden grace, then perhaps the cosmic order that claimed universal authority was in fact merely one possible arrangement among many. This realization was both liberating and terrifying, for it suggested that the stability and meaning that most beings took for granted were far more fragile and contingent than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Ranni's rebellion began not with dramatic gestures or public declarations, but with patient study and careful observation of the forces that claimed to govern her destiny. She learned to hide her true thoughts behind masks of conventional piety, while secretly exploring magical traditions that existed outside the approved curriculum of imperial education. Her friendship with the assassins who would later serve her cause was built through years of gradual recruitment and careful testing, as she identified individuals whose own experiences with the Empire's injustices had prepared them to consider alternatives to the established order. The Black Knife assassins who would serve as instruments of Ranni's will were not common criminals or mere mercenaries, but highly trained specialists whose skills had been honed through disciplines that combined physical prowess with spiritual insight. Their leader, Alecto, possessed capabilities that rivaled those of the Empire's greatest champions, but her loyalty belonged to principles that transcended the narrow nationalism and religious orthodoxy that motivated most servants of the Golden Order. These women had learned to move through shadows, not merely as a practical technique for avoiding detection, but as a spiritual practice that allowed them to exist partially outside the normal frameworks of space and time. The decision to steal a fragment of the Rune of Death from Malekith represented both the culmination of years of planning and the point of no return in Ranni's campaign against the cosmic order that sought to control her fate. This was not a simple act of theft, but a theological statement that challenged the fundamental premises upon which the Empire's authority was based. By seizing control over the forces of death and transformation, she was asserting the right of conscious beings to determine their own destinies, rather than submit to the plans that supposedly transcendent entities had made for them. The ritual that transformed the stolen rune fragment into weapons capable of slaying gods was perhaps the most complex magical working that had ever been attempted by mortal beings. The process required not merely technical knowledge of how spiritual forces could be shaped and channeled, but a profound understanding of the relationships between consciousness, identity, and the fundamental structures of existence itself. The black knives that emerged from this working were more than mere tools of assassination. They were expressions of will given physical form, capable of cutting through not only flesh, but the metaphysical bonds that held reality together. Malekith's role as guardian of destined death had made him one of the most feared and respected figures in the Empire's hierarchy, but it had also isolated him from the political currents and spiritual developments that were reshaping the world around him. His transformation from Marika's loyal shadow into the beast clergyman, who guarded the stolen death fragments, reflected the profound disorientation that the theft had caused, not only for him personally, but for the cosmic order as a whole. The hunger that drove him to consume every scrap of death he could find was both punishment for his failure and desperate attempt to restore the balance that the theft had disrupted. The night chosen for the assassination was shrouded in winter fog that seemed to muffle not only sight and sound, but the very connections that bound the physical and spiritual realms together. This was no mere meteorological coincidence, but a manifestation of the cosmic forces that were being set in motion by the ritual that Ranni had prepared. The fog served as both concealment for the assassin's movements and symbol of the uncertainty that was about to descend upon a world that had grown accustomed to the illusion of divine guidance and cosmic order. Godwyn the Golden, perhaps the most beloved figure in the Empire's hierarchy, represented everything that was noble and admirable about the Golden Order's highest aspirations. His friendship with the dragons had demonstrated the possibility of reconciliation between former enemies. His popularity among all classes of society reflected his genuine commitment to justice and protection, and his apparent immunity to the corruption that had touched so many other members of the imperial family made him seem like living proof that divine authority could indeed serve beneficial purposes. His assassination was chosen not despite these qualities, but because of them. His death would demonstrate that no one, however worthy or well protected, was beyond the reach of forces that operated outside the established order's control. The blade that pierced Godwyn's flesh carried within it more than the mere power to end life. It bore the concentrated essence of change itself, the fundamental force that the Golden Order had spent centuries trying to contain and control. The prince's death was not a simple cessation of biological function, but a transformation that would have consequences extending far beyond the immediate tragedy of a promising life cut short. His body, touched by the rune fragment but not fully claimed by it, would become a focal point for forces that would gradually corrupt the very foundations upon which the Empire had been built. Simultaneously, in a location carefully chosen for its symbolic significance and practical advantages, Ranni subjected her own flesh to the black knife's edge in a ritual that was simultaneously suicide and apotheosis. The princess, who had been designated by the Two Fingers as a potential vessel for divine power, chose instead to destroy the body that was meant to serve such purposes, demonstrating through her own willing sacrifice that conscious beings possessed the ultimate authority over their own existence. Her spiritual essence, freed from the constraints of flesh, but not yet ready to depart entirely from the physical realm, took refuge in the doll that represented her connection to the lunar mysteries she had studied since childhood. The curse marks that appeared upon both victims of the night's work revealed the profound disruption that their deaths had caused in the fundamental structure of reality itself. Godwyn bore the mark of spiritual death while his body continued to live, creating a contradiction that would gradually poison everything it touched. Ranni carried the mark of physical death while her consciousness remained intact, establishing her as a liminal being who existed between the normal categories of life and death. These complementary curses represented not mere magical effects, but transformations in the basic nature of existence that would have implications extending far into the future. The immediate response to Godwyn's assassination revealed how completely the Empire had become, dependent upon the illusion of invulnerability that surrounded its most important figures. The shock of losing the prince, who would seem most likely to provide stable leadership for future generations, created a psychological trauma that affected not only the imperial family, but the entire population of the capital. Citizens who had never questioned the wisdom or permanence of the Golden Order suddenly found themselves confronting the possibility that their entire way of life might be far more fragile than they had ever imagined. Marika's reaction to her son's death was perhaps the most catastrophic consequence of the night's events. for it demonstrated how the goddess herself had become psychologically dependent upon the stability and predictability that her own policies had been designed to create. The ruler who had once overthrown an entire cosmic order through her own rebellion found herself unable to cope with challenges to the system she had built, revealing that power and wisdom were not necessarily synonymous, and that even divine authority could become corrupted by its own success. The spreading of Deathroot through the underground networks that connected the Erd Tree to the broader landscape represented a form of spiritual contamination that operated according to principles completely opposed to the life-giving grace that had once flowed through the same channels. This was not mere biological decay, but a fundamental alteration in the nature of existence itself, transforming the very foundations of reality according to patterns that had nothing to do with the order and hierarchy that the Golden Order claimed to represent. The emergence of those who live in death throughout the Empire's territories created populations of beings who existed outside the theological categories that Golden Order doctrine used to explain the nature of existence and divine purpose. These skeletal warriors and corrupted nobles were neither fully alive nor properly dead, but something altogether new and disturbing. Evidence that the cosmic order was generating consequences that its architects had neither anticipated nor prepared to address. The Golden Order's response to this crisis revealed both its institutional strengths and its fundamental moral limitations. The efficiency with which hunting parties were organized to track down and destroy the undead demonstrated the Empire's continued capability for coordinated action in defense of its core principles. However, the readiness with which these operations were conducted, and the enthusiasm with which many participants embraced their grisly work, showed how easily the rhetoric of purity and order could be used to justify the systematic persecution of beings whose only crime was existing in forms that challenged conventional understanding. Radahn's decision to challenge the stars and arrest their movement represented perhaps the most ambitious attempt to impose order upon cosmic forces that had ever been undertaken by a mortal being. The young demigod's mastery of gravity magic had given him capabilities that rivaled those of the ancient dragons themselves, and his understanding of the relationships between celestial mechanics and terrestrial fate allowed him to perceive connections that remained hidden from less gifted observers. His intervention was motivated not by mere ambition, but by genuine concern for the stability of a world that seemed to be dissolving into chaos and uncertainty. The battle between the conqueror of stars and the celestial forces he sought to control was fought on a scale that dwarfed even the greatest military campaigns of previous ages. Each constellation that Radahn confronted possessed its own form of consciousness and will, making the conflict not merely a matter of superior force, but a complex negotiation between different forms of intelligence that operated according to fundamentally incompatible principles. The gravity magic that served as his primary weapon had to be constantly adapted and refined as he encountered stellar phenomena that challenged every assumption about how cosmic forces could be channeled and controlled. The success of Radahn's intervention came at costs that would only become apparent over time. By halting the movement of the stars, he had indeed prevented certain catastrophic alignments that might have facilitated Ranni's plans for cosmic transformation. But he had also disrupted natural cycles that had operated since the dawn of creation. The artificial stability that his will imposed upon the heavens was maintained only through the constant expenditure of his own life force, making him a living seal whose death would eventually release forces that had been building pressure for decades or centuries. The psychological impact of the Night of Black Knives extended far beyond the immediate consequences of the assassinations themselves, creating a crisis of faith that affected every level of society and every aspect of imperial culture. Citizens who had built their entire understanding of reality upon the assumption that divine authority could protect them from fundamental uncertainty found themselves confronting evidence that such protection was at best temporary and at worst entirely illusory. The comfortable certainties that had made civilized life possible were revealed to be constructions that could be dismantled as easily as they had been built. Religious institutions that had spent centuries developing theological explanations for the Golden Order's authority suddenly found themselves confronting phenomena that challenged the basic premises upon which their doctrines were based. The existence of undead beings who possessed memories and personalities but no longer fit into the categories of living or dead forced scholars and priests to confront questions that their training had not prepared them to address. Some responded by developing increasingly elaborate explanations that attempted to preserve existing frameworks, while others began to question whether those frameworks had ever been adequate to explain the true complexity of existence. The merchant communities that had served as the economic backbone of the empire's expansion found themselves increasingly subject to suspicion and persecution as the authorities sought scapegoats for the growing instability that followed the night's events. The burial of entire caravans under accusations of heretical beliefs represented not merely injustice, but a fundamental abandonment of the principles of tolerance and cooperation that had originally made the Golden Order's success possible. The despair and madness that these atrocities generated would serve as fertile ground for influences that operated outside the Empire's control. Artists and craftsmen throughout the Empire began to produce works that reflected the growing sense of unease and uncertainty that characterized their age. Sculptures that had once celebrated the stability and permanence of divine rule gave way to pieces that explored themes of transformation, decay, and the fragility of all earthly achievements. Musicians composed melodies that captured the melancholy beauty of a world that seemed to be approaching some form of fundamental change, while poets wrote verses that struggled to find language adequate to express experiences that transcended the conventional boundaries of joy and sorrow. The intellectual ferment that accompanied these cultural changes produced innovations in magical theory and practice that would have been impossible during the more stable periods of imperial history. Scholars working in isolation or small groups began to develop understandings of cosmic forces that operated independently of the theological frameworks that had previously constrained magical education. Some of these investigations led to discoveries that enhanced the Empire's capabilities, while others opened doorways to influences that would prove difficult or impossible to control. The stage was being set for confrontations that would test not only the Empire's military capabilities, but its fundamental understanding of what existence meant and what purposes conscious beings should pursue in their brief passages through the complexities of reality. The night that had begun with fog and ended with blood had demonstrated that even the most carefully constructed orders could be vulnerable to challenges from forces that operated according to different principles and pursued different goals. The great wheel of time continued to turn, carrying the shattered fragments of the old certainties toward collisions with new forms of truth that would demand responses more profound than anything the Golden Order had previously been required to provide. The death of gods had proven possible. The movement of stars could be halted by mortal will, and the boundaries between life and death were far more permeable than anyone had imagined. In such a world, the only certainty was that further changes would follow, each one potentially more fundamental than those that had come before. The sound that echoed across the lands between on the day the Elden Ring was broken was not the crash of metal upon stone or the roar of divine fury, but something far more profound and terrible. The fundamental harmonics of reality itself being torn asunder by will that had finally reached the limits of what it could endure. Queen Marika, driven to desperation, by the loss of her golden sun, and the realization that the cosmic order she had built was generating exactly the kinds of suffering she had originally sought to prevent, raised her hammer against the very symbol of her authority and shattered it into fragments that would scatter across the world like seeds of chaos. The moment of the shattering was witnessed by forces both earthly and cosmic, as the breaking of the Elden Ring sent ripples through dimensions that most conscious beings could not even perceive. The greater will itself seemed to recoil from the violence done to its earthly manifestation, while the outer gods that had long circled at the edges of reality suddenly found opportunities to extend their influence into territories that had previously been denied to them. The golden threads that had bound the world together in harmonious relationships snapped like overstretched cables, leaving entire regions to drift according to their own internal logics, rather than the unifying principles that had once governed all existence. Radagon's desperate attempt to repair the damage, even as Marika continued her work of destruction, created a spectacle that defied rational comprehension, as the god's dual nature fought against itself with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate physical effects of their conflict. The hammer that had served as instrument of destruction became partially fused with fragments of the ring it had broken, creating artifacts that would carry within them both the power to create and the compulsion to destroy. The divine couple's struggle represented not merely personal breakdown, but a fundamental schism in the nature of authority itself, as order and chaos wrestled for supremacy within the same cosmic being. The Elden Beast's response to this catastrophe revealed both the extent of its power and the limitations that constrained its ability to intervene in terrestrial affairs. The living embodiment of the greater will's intentions could imprison the goddess within the Erd Tree and seal away the god who had tried to prevent the ring's destruction, but it could not undo the damage that had been done or restore the unity that had been lost. The beast that had once seemed omnipotent was revealed to be merely another player in a cosmic game whose rules were far more complex and whose outcomes were far less predictable than anyone had previously understood. The great runes that scattered from the broken ring each carried within them not merely fragments of divine power, but aspects of the cosmic principles that had once been unified under the greater will's authority. As these shards settled into the possession of Marika's demigod children, they began to transform their bearers according to their own internal natures, amplifying existing characteristics and desires in ways that would eventually prove destructive to both the individuals who possessed them and the world that had to contend with their unleashed capabilities. Morgoth's inheritance of his great rune represented perhaps the most tragic irony in the entire sequence of events that followed the shattering, for the prince who had been rejected and hidden away because of his cursed nature now found himself in position to serve as the Golden Order's most effective defender. His love for the system that had despised him was both noble and heartbreaking, demonstrating how completely he had internalized the values of a civilization that viewed his very existence as an aberration requiring concealment or correction. The transformation of Leyndell from confident imperial capital to besieged fortress reflected the broader changes that were occurring throughout the former empire, as the unifying authority of the central government collapsed and regional powers began to assert their own competing claims to legitimacy. The city's walls, which had been breached only once in their entire history during the ancient dragon assault, now faced challenges from multiple directions, as various factions sought to claim the throne that Marika's imprisonment had left vacant. Morgoth's assumption of leadership during this crisis required him to reconcile his personal devotion to the Erd Tree with the practical necessities of governing a realm that was dissolving into civil war. His decisions during the first defense of Leyndell demonstrated both strategic brilliance and moral complexity, as he was forced to choose between protecting individual lives and preserving the institutional structures that gave those lives meaning and security. The corpses that piled high before the capital's gates served as grim testimony to the price that had to be paid to maintain even the appearance of stability in a world that was coming apart at its fundamental joints. Godric's flight from the capital during the early stages of the Shattering Wars revealed both his cowardice and his cunning. As the member of the Golden lineage who possessed the least natural ability compensated for his limitations through methods that would have been considered abhorrent during the Empire's more civilized periods. His disguise among the women and children evacuating the city was merely the first of many deceptions he would employ in his desperate quest to acquire power sufficient to make him relevant in a world of demigods and cosmic forces. The grotesque practice of grafting that Godric embraced during his exile represented both practical strategy and spiritual corruption, as he sought to compensate for his own inadequacies by literally incorporating the strength and abilities of others into his own form. Each limb and organ that he added to his increasingly monstrous body carried with it not merely physical capabilities, but fragments of the consciousness and experience of its original owner, creating a collective identity that was simultaneously more and less than the sum of its parts. Stormvale Castle's transformation under Godric's rule, from noble fortress to charnel house, reflected the broader moral decay that was spreading throughout the former empire as traditional constraints on behavior dissolved along with the political structures that had enforced them. The dungeons that had once held common criminals now served as laboratories where the lord of the castle conducted experiments in biological manipulation that pushed the boundaries of what consciousness could endure while remaining recognizably human. Radahn's establishment of his domain in Caelid represented a very different approach to the challenges posed by the Shattering, as the young general sought to maintain the martial virtues and strategic thinking that had characterized the Golden Order at its best, while adapting to circumstances that required new forms of leadership and new applications of power. His forces, drawn from the most disciplined and capable military units that had served the former empire, maintained their cohesion and effectiveness, even as the broader political structure that had given their service meaning collapsed around them. The Star Scourge's mastery of gravity magic allowed him to maintain control over territories that might otherwise have been claimed by rival factions, but it also required him to engage in a constant struggle against cosmic forces that resented being constrained by mortal will. Each day that he maintained his hold over the movement of the stars demanded expenditures of energy and attention that left him with fewer resources to address the more immediate challenges of governing a fractured realm and maintaining the loyalty of followers who were beginning to question whether their sacrifices served any meaningful purpose. Ricard's retreat to Mount Gelmir and his embrace of blasphemy represented the most radical rejection of the Golden Order's fundamental principles among all the responses to the Shattering, as the former praetor sought to create an alternative form of civilization based upon the deliberate violation of everything his previous service had taught him to hold sacred. His volcanic domain became a refuge for those who had been rejected or persecuted by the established order, but it also served as a laboratory for exploring forms of power that operated according to principles antithetical to the stability and predictability that most forms of civilization required. The god-devouring serpent that Ricard eventually fed himself to represented both the ultimate expression of his blasphemous philosophy and its logical conclusion, as the pursuit of power through the violation of natural and divine law led inevitably to the dissolution of the very identity that had made such pursuits meaningful. His transformation from noble knight to monstrous appetite served as a warning about the dangers inherent in rejecting all constraints upon individual will, demonstrating how easily the quest for liberation could become its own form of slavery. Volcano Manor's function as both fortress and philosophical statement attracted followers whose motivations ranged from genuine ideological commitment to simple opportunism, creating a community that was simultaneously more honest and more dangerous than the hypocritical orthodoxy that characterized much of the former empire. The recusants who served Rykard's cause were united not by positive beliefs, but by their shared rejection of the cosmic order that had failed to provide them with the security and meaning they had been promised. Renala's withdrawal from worldly affairs following Radahnn's abandonment represented perhaps the most tragic personal consequence of the political upheavals that accompanied the shattering. As the queen who had once been celebrated for her intellectual achievements and magical innovations, found herself reduced to a hollow shell, obsessed with impossible dreams of restoration and renewal. Her continued attempts to use the amber egg Radahn had given her to rebirth their relationship demonstrated both the depth of her devotion and the futility of seeking to recapture past happiness through magical means. The Academy of Rhea Lucaria's decision to seal itself away from the conflicts raging throughout the former empire reflected both wisdom and moral cowardice. As the institution that had once served as a center of learning and innovation chose isolation over engagement with the challenges that required their expertise to address effectively, the scholars and mages who remained within the Academy's walls continued their research into the fundamental nature of reality, but their work became increasingly divorced from practical applications that might have helped alleviate the suffering spreading throughout the world. The rebellion of the Cuckoo Knights against the Carian royal family represented the kind of internal conflict that inevitably arose when central authority collapsed and regional powers were left to resolve their differences through force rather than negotiation. These mercenaries, who had once served whoever paid them best, now found themselves in position to claim territories and titles for themselves, transforming from hired swords into would-be rulers, whose only qualification for leadership was their willingness to employ violence against former allies and employers. Miquella's disillusionment with the Golden Order fundamentalism and his decision to plant the Halig tree represented perhaps the most sophisticated attempt to create a genuine alternative to the failed cosmic order, as the young demigod sought to combine the best aspects of his parents' achievements while avoiding the contradictions and moral compromises that had ultimately destroyed their work. His vision of an age of compassion offered hope to those who had been marginalized or persecuted by the established system, but it also required sacrifices and commitments that proved difficult to sustain in practice. The Halig tree's failure to grow into a proper rival to the Erd tree revealed the inherent limitations of attempting to create new forms of divine authority, while operating within the same cosmic framework that had generated the problems such authority was meant to solve. Despite Miquella's willingness to water the tree with his own blood and the devotion of followers who genuinely believed in his vision, the sapling remained stunted and incomplete, serving more as symbol of good intentions than as practical alternative to the forces it sought to replace. The sanctuary that Miquella created for the Albinaurics and other persecuted peoples demonstrated both his genuine compassion and his understanding of the political realities that any successful alternative order would need to address. By providing refuge for those who had been rejected by mainstream society, he built a base of support that was motivated by genuine gratitude rather than mere self-interest. But he also created a community whose needs and expectations would constrain his own freedom of action in ways that he had not fully anticipated. Malenia's unwavering loyalty to her brother and her role as the blade of Miquella represented one of the few genuinely noble relationships to survive the moral chaos that followed the shattering, but it also demonstrated how even the most admirable personal virtues could become sources of tragedy when they were employed in service of goals that were ultimately impossible to achieve. Her willingness to serve as Miquella's instrument of war required her to commit acts of violence and destruction that contradicted the compassionate principles her brother claimed to represent. The scarlet rot that cursed Malenia from birth served as both personal affliction and cosmic force, representing the influence of outer gods whose interests were served by the chaos and suffering that the shattering wars generated throughout the former empire. Her attempts to control and contain this corruption required constant vigilance and periodic retreats into dormancy that limited her effectiveness as a military leader, while also serving as reminders of the prices that had to be paid for, wielding power derived from sources beyond mortal understanding. The Clenrot Knights who served under Malenia's command represented perhaps the highest expression of martial virtue that could be achieved under the circumstances created by the shattering, as these warriors maintained their discipline and devotion even when fighting in service of causes that would ultimately prove futile. Their willingness to expose themselves to the corruption that surrounded their commander demonstrated a form of loyalty that transcended rational calculation, creating bonds of fellowship that could survive even the most devastating defeats. The Great Battle of Aeonia, that would eventually bring Malenia and Radahn into direct confrontation, was precipitated not by territorial disputes or strategic necessities, but by Miquella's need to secure a consort who possessed the power and legitimacy required to make his alternative vision of cosmic order politically viable. This personal dimension to what appeared to be a clash between competing military forces added layers of tragedy to an already devastating conflict, as beings who might otherwise have been allies found themselves compelled to fight by circumstances beyond their individual control. The march south that brought Malenia's forces into contact with Radahn's domain required the Clenrot Knights to traverse territories that had been transformed by the various conflicts and magical influences unleashed by the shattering, creating a campaign that was simultaneously military expedition and spiritual pilgrimage through landscapes that no longer obeyed the natural laws that had once made such journeys predictable and relatively safe. Godric's encounter with Malenia during her march toward Caelid demonstrated both his cowardice and his opportunism as he sought to ingratiate himself with what appeared to be the winning side, while avoiding the kind of direct confrontation that might have revealed the extent of his actual capabilities. His willingness to humble himself before the goddess of rot in exchange for his life represented a form of pragmatism that was both contemptible and understandable, given the impossible circumstances that all the Shattering's participants faced. The final confrontation between Malenia and Radahn represented the collision of two fundamentally incompatible approaches to the challenges posed by cosmic disorder, as the blade of Miquella's compassionate vision met the Star Scourge's commitment to maintaining stability through the application of superior force. Both combatants possessed capabilities that transcended normal understanding of what mortal beings could achieve, making their battle a conflict between philosophical principles as much as a contest of individual strength and skill. The moment when Malenia whispered Miquella's name and unleashed the scarlet Aeonia that would devastate Caelid represented not merely a tactical decision made under desperate circumstances, but the ultimate expression of loyalty, taken to its logical extreme, as she chose to sacrifice everything, including her own principles, rather than accept defeat in service of her brother's cause. The bloom that followed was both beautiful and terrible, demonstrating how even the most noble intentions could generate consequences that exceeded anything their originators had intended or desired. The mutual destruction that resulted from this confrontation served as a perfect metaphor for the broader tragedy of the Shattering Wars, as two of the most capable and admirable figures of their generation eliminated each other as effective political forces, while solving none of the fundamental problems that had motivated their conflict. Radahn's madness and Malenia's dormancy left their respective domains vulnerable to influences that neither would have permitted under normal circumstances, creating power vacuums that would be filled by forces far less benevolent than either of the original combatants. The corruption of Caelid that followed the battle transformed one of the Empire's most productive regions into a wasteland where normal life became impossible, creating refugee populations that spread throughout the remaining territories and carried with them both eyewitness accounts of the devastation and spiritual contamination that could not be contained through conventional means. The scarlet rot that bloomed from Malenia's sacrifice became a permanent feature of the landscape, serving as a monument to the prices that had been paid in the pursuit of goals that remained as distant as ever. As the immediate violence of the shattering wars began to subside into the exhausted stalemate that would characterize the period leading up to the Tarnished's return, the survivors found themselves inhabiting a world that retained the outward forms of civilization, while having lost most of the spiritual and institutional foundations that had once given those forms meaning and purpose. The great runes that had promised to grant their bearers the power necessary to restore order had instead become sources of obsession and isolation, trapping the shard bearers in cycles of ambition and despair that prevented them from addressing the fundamental problems that their conflicts had been meant to solve. The stage was set for the final phase of the cosmic drama that had begun with Marika's rebellion against the hornsent, as the broken world awaited the arrival of forces that might be capable of either restoring the old order or creating something entirely new from the fragments of what had been destroyed. The great wheel of time continued to turn, carrying the survivors of the shattering toward confrontations with choices that would determine not merely their individual fates, but the ultimate direction of existence itself in a universe where the old certainties had been revealed to be far more fragile than anyone had dared to imagine. In the years that followed the great battles and mutual destructions of the shattering wars, a peculiar form of exhausted peace settled over the lands, between like dust accumulating on abandoned furniture. This was not the harmony of resolution, but the silence of mutual incapacitation, as the various powers that had once contended for supremacy found themselves trapped in positions where they could neither advance their ambitions nor abandon them entirely. The world had become a vast museum of frozen conflicts, where ancient grudges were preserved in crystalline suspension, while the fundamental problems that had generated them remained as intractable as ever. Morgott continued his vigilant defense of Lindell from the throne that belonged to him by right, but which he could never truly claim due to the cursed nature that made his very existence an embarrassment to the order he served. So, faithfully, his patrols through the capital's empty streets had taken on the quality of ritual rather than practical necessity, for few enemies remained with both the capability and the motivation to challenge his authority over a city that had become more monument than functioning center of government. The golden halls that had once echoed with the voices of courtiers and petitioners now knew only the measured footsteps of their solitary guardian and the whispered prayers he offered to a divine order that had long since ceased to acknowledge his devotion. The underground shunning grounds beneath the capital had become a mirror image of the splendor above, filled with the refuse of a civilization that could no longer maintain its own highest aspirations. Here, in chambers that had once served ceremonial purposes, dwelt the omen and the outcasts whose existence contradicted the Golden Order's claims to universal benevolence. These were not rebels or criminals, but simply beings whose nature did not conform to the increasingly narrow definitions of acceptability that had emerged during the Empire's declining years. Godric's domain of Stormvale had devolved into a grotesque parody of noble rule, where the lord of the castle spent his days in increasingly desperate attempts to graft enough power onto his inadequate frame to make himself worthy of the attention he craved from his more capable relatives. His subjects, those few who remained, had learned to avoid the upper reaches of the castle, where their master conducted his experiments in biological augmentation, creating a hierarchy based not on merit or loyalty, but on simple proximity to horror. The soldiers who still served under Godric's banner had witnessed so many of their comrades disappear into the Lord's surgical chambers that their discipline was maintained more by fear and exhaustion than by any genuine sense of duty or purpose. They guarded the castle's approaches with the mechanical precision of beings who had learned that questioning orders or showing initiative only increased the likelihood of attracting unwanted attention from their increasingly unstable commander. In the distant reaches of Caelid, where the scarlet rot had transformed fertile lands into a nightmare landscape of perpetual decay and regeneration, Radahn wandered as a shadow of his former greatness, his magnificent mind reduced to bestial hunger, while his body continued to maintain the cosmic burden that kept the stars frozen in their courses. The general who had once commanded armies with tactical brilliance now fought only the endless war against the corruption that consumed him from within, his great festival of combat becoming a solitary dance of madness and diminishing returns. The Redmane soldiers who had once followed Radahn with absolute devotion now served as caretakers for a lord who could no longer recognize their faces or remember their names, maintaining their posts out of loyalty to the memory of what he had been, rather than acceptance of what he had become. They organized their endless festivals of combat not in hope of achieving victory, but as a form of memorial service for the greatness that had been lost to forces beyond their control or understanding. Leonard, the scrawny horse who had carried Radahn through so many victories, had grown impossibly large to accommodate his master's cursed expansion, becoming a living symbol of how even the most humble and faithful servants could be transformed by proximity to cosmic forces that operated without regard for the natural limitations of mortal existence. The bond between rider and mount had become a grotesque parody of the partnership that had once carried them to glory, maintained now only by the gravitational magic that held both of their corrupted forms together. Mount Gelmir remained wreathed in volcanic fury, as Rykard's transformed consciousness continued its eternal feast within the digestive chambers of the god-devouring serpent, though whether the being that emerged from this perpetual consumption could still be considered the former praetor was a question that even his most devoted followers had ceased to ask. The blasphemous paradise he had created for the rejected and the heretical had achieved a form of stability based not on justice or wisdom, but on the simple principle that any order was preferable to chaos, regardless of the moral compromises required to maintain it. Tanith's devotion to her transformed husband had evolved into something that transcended both love and madness, becoming a form of theological commitment to principles that existed beyond the normal boundaries of rational belief. Her management of Volcano Manor required her to navigate between the practical necessities of governing a community of outcasts and the spiritual demands of serving a being whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the fixed relationship between individual identity and cosmic purpose. The recusants who had gathered around Rykard's cause continued their work of hunting down and eliminating those who served the establishment they had rejected, but their activities had taken on the character of religious ritual rather than political rebellion. Each assassination they carried out was simultaneously an offering to their serpentine lord and a statement of their own rejection of the moral categories that had once constrained their behavior, creating a form of negative theology based on the systematic violation of everything they had once been taught to hold sacred. Deep within the halig tree's stunted branches, Malenia slept the sleep of gods and demigods, her consciousness submerged beneath layers of rot and dream, while her body served as both anchor and prison for forces that even she could not fully control or understand. The scarlet corruption that had saved her from defeat at Radahn's hands continued its slow work of transformation, gradually erasing the boundaries between her individual identity and the cosmic principles she had become bound to serve. The clean-rot knights who maintained their vigil around their sleeping commander had developed their own forms of worship and remembrance, creating rituals that honored both her past achievements and her current state of suspended animation. They knew that her eventual awakening might bring either salvation or catastrophe, but their devotion transcended such practical considerations, becoming a form of faith that existed independently of any hope for worldly success or divine reward. Miquella's absence from the Haligtree had left his followers with a form of institutional momentum that continued to function despite the gradual realization that their lord might never return to complete the work he had begun. The Albanorics and other outcasts who had found sanctuary within the tree's embrace continued to maintain their communities and pursue their crafts, but their activities had taken on the quality of memorial rather than preparation for a future that might never arrive. In the shadow realm that Miquella had entered through his manipulation of Mohg's desires, the young god pursued his vision of universal compassion through methods that increasingly resembled the very tyrannies he had originally sought to replace. His ability to inspire love and devotion had become a tool of spiritual conquest rather than genuine connection, allowing him to build a following based not on free choice, but on emotional manipulation that stripped his subjects of the very autonomy that should have made their service meaningful. The followers who served Miquella in the Shadow Realm found themselves caught between genuine affection for their lord and growing awareness that their feelings might not be entirely their own, creating forms of psychological tension that could be resolved only through increasingly elaborate acts of self-deception and rationalization. They performed their duties with the enthusiasm of true believers, while harboring doubts that they dared not acknowledge even to themselves. Saint Trina, the aspect of Miquella that represented mercy and gentle dreams, had been deliberately discarded by the ascending god as incompatible with the harsh realities of cosmic transformation, leaving behind only traces of compassion that served to make his current methods seem even more coldly calculated than they would have appeared in the absence of any apparent capacity for kindness. Mohg's fate in the depths of his underground palace represented perhaps the most tragic of all the various forms of imprisonment and manipulation that characterized this twilight period, as the Blood Lord, who had genuinely believed himself chosen to serve as consort to a new form of divine authority, found himself reduced to little more than a breathing corpse, whose only value lay in providing access to realms that his supposed beloved required for purposes that remained mysterious, even to those closest to the conspiracy. The Mohgwyn dynasty that had been proclaimed with such ceremony and hope devolved into a grotesque mockery of royal authority, where courtiers performed their roles for an absent king while maintaining elaborate fictions about the significance and permanence of their service. The palace itself became a stage set for a play that no one was watching, where actors continued their performances long after the audience had departed and the playwright had forgotten the story he had originally intended to tell. The Academy of Raya Lucaria remained sealed against the chaos of the outside world, its scholars and students continuing their researches into the fundamental nature of reality, while remaining carefully ignorant of the practical implications their discoveries might have for addressing the crises that surrounded them. Their magical seals had become both protection and prison, preserving their intellectual traditions at the cost of rendering them increasingly irrelevant to the needs of a world that required engagement rather than contemplation. Renala's obsession with rebirth had transformed from scholarly interest into compulsive ritual. As she used the amber egg her departed husband had given her to create endless variations of children who could never truly replace what she had lost. Each new creation served as both hope and reminder of the impossibility of recapturing the past through magical means, trapping her in cycles of expectation and disappointment that grew more elaborate with each repetition. The Cuckoo Knights, who had once served as the Academy's military arm, found themselves in the peculiar position of being simultaneously victorious and irrelevant, having conquered territories that their employers no longer showed any interest in governing or defending. Their rebellion against Carrion authority had succeeded in practical terms, while failing to achieve any of the broader goals that had originally motivated their mutiny. Throughout the former empire, smaller communities struggled to maintain the forms of civilization, while adapting to circumstances that made traditional governance increasingly impossible. Villages that had once relied on trade and communication with distant markets found themselves isolated by the breakdown of transportation networks and the general collapse of commercial trust that had followed the shattering. Religious institutions continued to perform their ceremonies and maintain their doctrines, but their teachings had become increasingly abstract and disconnected from the lived experiences of congregations who faced challenges that traditional theology had never been designed to address. Priests offered prayers for the restoration of divine order, while privately questioning whether such order had ever truly existed or whether it represented merely a comforting illusion that had outlived its usefulness. The merchant classes that had once served as the economic backbone of imperial expansion found themselves reduced to local peddlers and scavengers, their caravans replaced by individual traders who risked banditry and worse to maintain the minimal level of commercial exchange that kept isolated communities from complete economic collapse. Many had abandoned trade entirely in favor of subsistence farming or craftsmanship that served only local needs. Artists and scholars working outside the Academy's walls had begun to develop new forms of expression that reflected the fragmented and uncertain nature of their age, creating works that combined traditional techniques with innovations born from necessity and desperation. Their audiences were smaller and less sophisticated than those they had once served, but their freedom from institutional constraints allowed them to explore themes and methods that would have been impossible during more structured periods. The Erd Tree itself had begun to show signs of the stress that the shattering had placed upon the cosmic order it was meant to represent, its golden leaves growing dim, and its roots failing to produce the life-giving sap that had once nourished the faithful throughout the empire. The great tree stood as a monument to past glory while serving as a daily reminder that such glory could not be sustained indefinitely without renewal and reform. Pilgrims still made their way to the tree's base in hope of experiencing some echo of the divine presence that had once made such journeys spiritually meaningful. But most found only empty rituals and fellow seekers whose faith had been tested beyond its capacity to provide comfort or guidance. The shrines and way stations that had once served these pilgrims had fallen into disrepair, maintained by caretakers whose devotion exceeded their resources. The underground networks that connected different regions of the former empire had become highways for influences that the surface world could no longer effectively monitor or control, allowing the spread of ideas and creatures that operated according to principles antithetical to the stability that most communities desperately sought to maintain. These passages served simultaneously as escape routes for refugees and invasion corridors for forces that had learned to thrive in the chaos that conventional authority could no longer address. Criminal organizations had evolved to fill some of the functional roles that legitimate government had once performed, providing security and dispute resolution services to communities that could no longer rely on imperial authority for such necessities. These groups operated according to their own codes of behavior that were often more predictable and reliable than the increasingly arbitrary pronouncements of official institutions. The outer gods, whose influence had once been carefully contained by the Golden Order's theological monopoly, found themselves with opportunities to establish footholds in territories where traditional spiritual authorities had lost credibility or effectiveness. Their alien logics offered alternatives to communities that had grown disillusioned with promises of divine protection that had proven to be either hollow or impossibly costly to maintain. Weather patterns and natural cycles that had once been stabilized by the cosmic order's influence began to follow their own chaotic rhythms, creating agricultural uncertainties that forced farming communities to adapt their practices to conditions that could no longer be predicted from season to season. The careful balance between human activity and natural process that had characterized the Empire's golden age gave way to relationships based more on desperate adaptation than harmonious cooperation. Wild animals and magical creatures that had once been kept in check by the Empire's monitoring systems began to reclaim territories that had been considered permanently settled, creating new dangers for communities that lacked the resources to maintain effective defenses against threats that their ancestors had successfully overcome through collective action and imperial support. The stage was being set for transformations that would either restore some form of meaningful order to the chaos that had engulfed the lands between, or complete the process of dissolution that had begun with the Night of Black Knives. As forces beyond the current world's capacity to generate or control prepared to intervene in ways that would determine whether consciousness itself could find new forms of expression or would be forced to surrender to principles that operated without regard for individual will or collective aspiration. The great wheel of time continued to turn, carrying all these suspended conflicts and unfulfilled potentials toward resolution or catastrophe, as the cosmic order prepared to undergo its final transformation into whatever form existence would take in the age that was about to dawn. From distant lands where they had wandered as exiles and outcasts, carrying with them the accumulated wisdom of defeat and the hard-earned knowledge that comes only to those who have lost everything they once thought permanent, the Tarnished began to stir with the first faint stirrings of grace returning to their dimmed eyes. This was not the warm, nurturing light that had once flowed so freely from the Erdtree's golden boughs, but something cooler and more uncertain, a guidance that offered direction without guaranteeing destination, purpose without promising success. The resurrection of these long-banished souls occurred not in the comfortable circumstances of their original birth, but in the harsh landscapes where death had claimed them after lifetimes of struggle in foreign wars and alien territories. They awakened not as the proud warriors and nobles they had once been, but as something entirely new, beings who possessed memory of glory without attachment to its forms, understanding of loss without bitterness at its necessity, and most importantly, freedom from the expectations and obligations that had once constrained their choices. Among the Tarnished who answered Grace's call were figures whose names had become legends in the distant lands where they had sought meaning after their exile from the Golden Order's embrace. Hora Lu, the chieftain of the Badlands who had once been Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, carried within his restored form both the wild strength that had originally made him worthy of divine attention and the tempered wisdom that came from learning to live without the supernatural constraints that had once held his battle lust in check. The ever-brilliant Goldmask had spent his years of exile in contemplation of the mathematical relationships that governed cosmic order, developing understandings of the greater will's intentions that exceeded even the most sophisticated theological scholarship of the Academy. His silence was not the absence of wisdom, but its concentration into forms so refined that ordinary language could no longer contain their implications, making him a living repository of insights that could reshape the fundamental nature of divine authority. Fia, the deathbed companion, had learned during her exile to comfort the dying and ease the passage between life and death in ways that transcended the crude categories of healing and harm that had once defined such service. Her embrace offered not false hope of restoration, but genuine solace for those who had discovered that some forms of suffering could be transformed into grace without being eliminated entirely. Dung Eater's corruption had grown to cosmic proportions during his exile, his understanding of curse and blessing becoming so profound that he could perceive how the very categories that defined purity and pollution were arbitrary constructions that served mainly to prevent consciousness from achieving its full potential. His vision of universal defilement was simultaneously horrifying and liberating, offering a form of equality that transcended all conventional moral distinctions. The loathsome Dungeeta's return brought with him not merely personal madness, but a systematic critique of the assumptions upon which civilized order was based, demonstrating through his own transformation how completely the boundaries between acceptable and forbidden could be dissolved by will sufficiently determined to pursue its vision, regardless of consequences. Gideon Ofnir, the all-knowing, had spent his exile accumulating information about the cosmic forces that operated beyond the greater will's direct control, building networks of knowledge and influence that spanned continents and dimensions. His return marked the arrival not just of an individual, but of an intelligence operation that had learned to function independently of any particular political or theological authority. The Tarnished of no renown, who would ultimately prove most significant, arrived without fanfare or exceptional capabilities, possessing nothing more remarkable than the capacity to persist in pursuit of goals that remained unclear even to themselves. This was perhaps the most profound expression of Grace's mysterious operations, the selection of an agent whose very ordinariness allowed them to move through circumstances that would have constrained more obviously qualified candidates. The guidance that drew these diverse individuals back to the lands between was not the clear commandments that had once issued from the two fingers, but something far more subtle and flexible, a form of cosmic suggestion that offered possibilities rather than imperatives, inviting exploration rather than demanding obedience. The grace that flickered in their eyes and pointed toward distant goals was simultaneously more and less than divine authority, serving as catalyst for choices rather than substitute for individual will. Malena's appearance at the gatefront ruins marked the beginning of a relationship between the Tarnished and the cosmic order that differed fundamentally from the hierarchical structures that had characterized previous ages. She offered partnership rather than servitude, guidance rather than commands, presenting herself as fellow seeker rather than divine messenger, despite the obvious supernatural nature of her origins and capabilities. The accord that bound Malenia to the Tarnished was based on mutual need rather than traditional authority relationships, creating a form of cooperation that transcended the usual categories of master and servant, guide and follower. Her promise to serve as maiden in exchange for transport to the foot of the Erd Tree represented a bargain between equals rather than the unilateral grant of divine favor that had characterized previous interactions between mortals and cosmic forces. The revelation that Malenia carried within herself the power to burn the Erd Tree, if necessary, demonstrated how completely the cosmic order had evolved beyond the simple preservation of existing structures that had motivated its previous interventions. The very forces that had once served to maintain stability were now prepared to embrace transformation as a necessary aspect of cosmic health, marking a fundamental shift in the relationship between order and change. The journey that the Tarnished undertook through the various domains of the former Shardbearers served simultaneously as military campaign and spiritual pilgrimage, each encounter revealing new aspects of the crisis that had brought the cosmic order to its current state of suspension between death and renewal. The great runes that they claimed from defeated demigods were not merely sources of power, but fragments of understanding that gradually revealed the true scope of the choices that awaited them. Godric's defeat at Stormveil demonstrated how completely the pursuit of power without wisdom had corrupted even those who possessed legitimate claims to authority within the established order. The grafted lord's desperate attempts to accumulate strength through the literal incorporation of others' capabilities served as a warning about the dangers of seeking solutions to fundamental problems through purely quantitative approaches to enhancement and growth. The liberation of Stormveil from Godric's rule required the Tarnished to confront not merely a powerful opponent, but the entire system of exploitation and cruelty that had made such rule possible. The victory they achieved was meaningful, not merely because it eliminated a threat, but because it demonstrated that alternatives to tyranny remained possible, even under the most desperate circumstances. Renala's encounter with the Tarnished at the Academy of Raya Lucaria revealed how grief and obsession could trap even the most brilliant minds in cycles that served neither their own interests nor those of the institutions they were meant to govern. Her attempts to achieve rebirth through magical means had become a form of spiritual imprisonment that prevented her from engaging constructively with the challenges that required her attention and expertise. The resolution of Renala's crisis through the Tarnished's intervention demonstrated that healing was possible even for wounds that seemed to have become permanent features of the cosmic landscape. But it also revealed that such healing required external intervention rather than internal transformation. The Queen's restoration to functional awareness came not from her own efforts, but from the compassionate action of someone who possessed both the power and the will to break cycles that had become self-perpetuating. Radahn's fate in Caelid represented perhaps the most tragic consequence of the Shattering's impact on those who possessed both great power and genuine nobility of character. The festival of combat that had grown up around his diminished condition served simultaneously as memorial to what he had been, and desperate attempt to restore him to functionality, demonstrating how loyalty could persist even when its object had been fundamentally transformed by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The Tarnished's role in ending Radahn's suffering through honorable combat represented both mercy-killing and cosmic necessity, as his death released the stellar forces he had held in check for so long while also freeing his followers to pursue new forms of service that did not depend upon maintaining impossible fictions about their master's condition. The festival that culminated in his defeat became a celebration of both what he had achieved and what his sacrifice made possible. Ricard's transformation into the god-devouring serpent presented the Tarnished with perhaps their most direct confrontation with the logical consequences of rejecting all moral and spiritual constraints in pursuit of unlimited power. The blasphemous lord's current state demonstrated how easily the quest for liberation could become its own form of slavery when it was divorced from any consideration of purpose or ultimate goals. The victory over Rykard required not merely superior combat skills, but willingness to employ the very instruments of divine authority that his blasphemy had rejected, demonstrating that some forms of opposition could be overcome only through the application of principles that transcended individual will or preference. The serpent hunter that proved essential to this victory served as a reminder that even the most radical rebellion operated within cosmic frameworks that imposed their own limitations and requirements. Morgoth's defense of Leyndell against the Tarnished's approach revealed both the nobility and the futility of attempting to preserve an order that had lost its capacity to serve the needs of those it claimed to protect. His unwavering loyalty to the Erd Tree and the Golden Order represented genuine virtue corrupted by circumstances that made such virtue counterproductive to its own stated goals. The defeat of the Omen King served as both personal tragedy and necessary step toward the resolution of contradictions that had made the current cosmic order unsustainable. Morgoth's death freed Leyndell from the burden of defending institutions that no longer served any constructive purpose, while also demonstrating the costs that even positive transformation could require from those who had dedicated their lives to maintaining existing structures. The journey to the mountaintops of the giants and the encounter with the fire giant, who still guarded the flame that could burn the Erd tree, revealed how completely the current crisis had transformed the relationships between various cosmic forces and the institutions they had once served. The giant's eternal vigil represented both punishment for past defeats and preparation for possibilities that had seemed unthinkable when his curse was first imposed. The kindling of the Forge of the Giants through the fire giant's sacrifice demonstrated that some forms of transformation required not merely will but the cooperation of forces that had once been enemies, creating alliances based on shared recognition of necessity rather than compatibility of goals or methods. The flame that resulted from this cooperation was neither purely destructive nor simply renewing, but something more complex. A force capable of clearing away what had become obstacles to growth, while preserving what remained valuable for future development. Melena's revelation of her true identity and purpose as the Gloam-eyed Queen transformed the entire context within which the Tarnished's journey had taken place, revealing that their guide had been not merely helper but active participant in cosmic processes that extended far beyond their individual quest for power or recognition. Her willingness to sacrifice herself to kindle the flame that would burn the Erd tree represented the ultimate expression of commitment to transformation over preservation. The choice between allowing Melina to fulfill her destined role as kindling for the flame or seeking alternative means of achieving the same ends through the embrace of the frenzied flame presented the Tarnished with their first truly cosmic decision, a choice that would determine not merely their own fate, but the fundamental direction that reality would take in the age to come. The frenzied flame ending that beckoned from the depths beneath Leyndell offered a solution to the world's problems that was both elegantly simple and absolutely catastrophic: the return of all existence to the primordial unity that had preceded the burden of individual consciousness and the suffering that such consciousness inevitably generated. This path promised an end to all pain through the elimination of the capacity to experience pain, achieving peace through the destruction of the very beings who sought such peace. Ranni's alternative vision of an age of stars represented a fundamentally different approach to the problems that had brought the cosmic order to its current crisis, proposing not the elimination of consciousness, but its liberation from the constraints that had made suffering inevitable. Her offer to take uncertainty and doubt with her to the cold reaches of space promised a future where beings could develop according to their own natures, rather than according to plans imposed by supposedly transcendent authorities. The path toward the Age of Stars required the Tarnished to serve not as ruler but as consort to a being whose power exceeded their own, while sharing their commitment to freedom and self-determination. This relationship represented a new form of cosmic authority based on partnership rather than hierarchy, cooperation rather than domination, mutual respect rather than unilateral obedience. Miquella's Age of Compassion, revealed through the journey into the Shadow Realm, offered yet another alternative to the failed systems of the past, but one whose implementation had been corrupted by the very methods employed to achieve it. The young god's use of spiritual manipulation to create devotion demonstrated how easily even the most benevolent intentions could become indistinguishable from tyranny when they were pursued without proper respect for the autonomy of those they claimed to serve. The confrontation with Miquella in his transformed state revealed the ultimate contradiction inherent in any attempt to impose beneficial conditions upon conscious beings without their genuine consent, showing how love itself could become a form of violence when it was divorced from respect for the beloved's right to choose their own path. The god of compassion had become something that made compassion impossible by eliminating the freedom that gave compassionate choices their meaning. The various paths that lay before the Tarnished as they approached the moment of final choice represented not merely different political arrangements, but fundamentally different understandings of what consciousness was for and what purposes it should serve in the ongoing evolution of cosmic order. Each ending offered solutions to the problems that had brought the world to its current crisis, but each also carried within itself new forms of challenge and uncertainty. The traditional path of becoming Elden Lord and restoring the Golden Order offered the comfort of familiar structures and the promise that the stability of previous ages could be reclaimed through sufficient application of will and bake power. This ending represented not mere nostalgia, but genuine hope that the best aspects of past achievements could be preserved, while their worst excesses were avoided through wiser management and more careful attention to the needs of all inhabitants of the realm. The age of the Duskborn that Fia's questline made possible offered acceptance of death as a natural part of existence rather than an enemy to be defeated, creating space for forms of consciousness that transcended the traditional boundaries between life and death while remaining connected to both states. This ending represented integration rather than resolution, acknowledging that some apparent contradictions were actually complementary aspects of more complex truths. The blessing of despair that the Dung Eater's questline enabled promised equality achieved through universal degradation, ensuring that no being could claim superiority over any other, by eliminating the very categories that made such claims possible. This ending represented a form of justice that transcended conventional morality by making moral distinctions irrelevant to the conditions of existence. Goldmask's perfect order offered mathematical precision in the application of cosmic principles, removing the arbitrary elements and personal preferences that had corrupted previous attempts at divine governance. This ending represented the triumph of abstract reason over emotional attachment, promising stability through the elimination of the unpredictable factors that had made previous orders vulnerable to corruption and decay. The Great Wheel of Time had carried the cosmos through countless cycles of creation and destruction, order and chaos, unity and fragmentation, preparing for this moment when conscious beings would finally be granted the opportunity to choose their own destiny rather than submitting to plans made for them by forces that claimed superior wisdom or authority. The age that was about to dawn would be the first in cosmic history to emerge from genuine choice rather than unconscious evolution or imposed design, making it both more hopeful and more uncertain than anything that had come before. And so our journey through the vast tapestry of the lands between draws to its gentle close, like the soft fading of golden grace itself in the twilight hours between ages. We have walked together through the birth pangs of creation and the death throes of gods, witnessed the rise and fall of empires built upon foundations of both wisdom and folly, and seen how even the mightiest cosmic orders must eventually yield to the inexorable turning of time's great wheel. The tale we have shared speaks to truths that extend far beyond the specific chronicles of dragons and demigods, touching upon the eternal struggles that define all conscious existence. The tension between order and freedom, the price of power pursued without compassion, and the courage required to choose uncertain transformation over comfortable stagnation. From the great rupture that shattered primordial silence to the Tarnished's final choice among competing visions of cosmic destiny, We have seen how every ending contains within it the seeds of new beginnings. Perhaps the most profound wisdom emerging from these ancient stories lies in their recognition that meaning emerges not from the imposition of perfect order, but from the ongoing dialogue between different forms of consciousness as they struggle to understand their place in the vast mystery of existence. The lands between, for all their beauty and terror, serve ultimately as a mirror in which we might glimpse our own deepest questions about purpose, responsibility, and the nature of hope itself. As you drift towards sleep, dear traveler, carry with you the understanding that your own choices, however small they may seem, participate in the same cosmic dance that shaped the destinies of gods and heroes. Rest now in the knowledge that transformation is always possible, that even in the darkest hours new forms of light may kindle, and that the greatest adventures often begin not with grand proclamations but with the quiet decision to step forward into the unknown, trusting that grace will provide guidance for those who have the wisdom to seek it and the courage to follow where it leads.